like to call this council and committee meeting to order. Madam Clerk, the roll call, please.
Your worship, all members of council are present this evening.
Thank you. There are two addenda this evening. One is to add a delegation, Jill Yulke, with respect to the Crystal Beach 2019 parking study, and one to remove the Town of Fort Erie Housing Needs Study because of an error in an appendix that was attached to the original report. But we will continue with the presentation that's affiliated with that when we get to Planning and Development Services. Just a couple of announcements. The Santa Claus Parade is this Saturday, starting at 4 o'clock on Jarvis Street. I understand the weather's supposed to be good, and I understand that there's a special guest coming into Fort Erie from the north. Second, we had a number of Remembrance Day ceremonies in Fort Erie this past weekend, 5 in total. I want to thank the councillors that stood in for me in some of the ceremonies that I couldn't get to, and thank all of the councillors for supportive of our veterans. It occurred to me as I was listening to the roll call at one of the ceremonies that a number of the veterans who were killed in the line of duty for Canada have streets named after them in Fort Erie. But there are a number of other veterans who do not have that particular honor. And I've often found it curious, although we have a list of acceptable street names which developers are entitled to resort to when they do their developments, I think that we should really be encouraging developers to utilize the names of those individuals who, for their country, lost their lives in the service of their country, to make sure that we enjoyed the rights and the privileges that we do in a democratic society. So I know that it's optional, but I've even contemplated the idea of maybe bringing a motion that we place some priority on that type of idea. Anyways, just what was going through my head as I was standing in the snow on Monday in Ridgeway, and that was also an interesting reminder. Okay, so that takes us then to declaration of pecuniary interest. Are there any this evening? Councillor Dubanow.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. I'm going to be declaring a conflict on PDS 65-2019, as well as the associated public meeting for the proposed draft plan of subdivision, combined official plan, and zoning bylaw amendment for Ashton Homes Western Limited, Park Lane Home Builders Limited, and Delta Bingo Incorporated, as I live in a subdivision developed by Ashton Homes Western Limited that has not yet been transferred to the municipality.
Thank you. Are there any others? If there aren't, then we have some upcoming public meetings primarily related to the budget schedule. They're outlined in the agenda. The next meeting is December the 4th, 2019, and that we'll be dealing with water and wastewater operating budget and user fees analysis. The third budget meeting will be January the 22nd, 2020. We'll be dealing with the general levy operating budget and assessment analysis. If necessary, there'll be, as well as the library budget. If necessary, there'll be a fourth meeting on January the 29th, 2020. Those meetings all take place here in the council chamber at 6 p.m. The budget bylaws are scheduled for December the 9th, 2019 would be the preliminary capital budget. The January the 20th, 2020 would be the water and wastewater budget and rates bylaw. And February the 10th, 2020, if all things go according to Hoyle, would be the general levy budget and general capital budget. Those take place during the regular council meetings. If necessary, there would be a meeting on Monday, March the 16th, 2020, to deal with any bylaws that have not yet been dealt with. There are two public meetings this evening, the first of which relates to the draft plan of subdivision, official plan amendment, and property rezoning for Ashton Homes, Park Lane Home Builders, and Delta Bingo, Inc., with respect to property located in Peacebridge Village, known as Phase 2 subdivision. And Daryl Vanderveen will be providing us with some background with respect to that. The format will be that council will hear from the staff with respect to the applications that have been made that are the subject of the public meeting. We'll then ask the proponent if he or someone on his behalf wishes to address us, or the proponents. And then we'll hear from anyone who's in support of the applications and anyone then who is opposed to the applications. So Mr. Van der Veen, we'll start with you. Good evening.
Property as well as the surrounding neighborhood. The subject lands are located in the middle of the Garrison neighborhood, which is south of Garrison Road and east of Arthur Street. The subject property is located on the east side of Arthur Street and is directly west of Peace Bridge Village Phase 1. The following are the land uses surrounding the subject property. To the north, several single detached dwellings along Arthur Street and a commercial plaza on the south side of Garrison Road. To the south, vacant wooden residential land. To the east, single detached dwellings and vacant residential land associated with the Peace Bridge Village Phase 1 subdivision. To the west, 2 single detached dwellings and vacant wooden residential land. This slide shows the proposed draft plan for Peace Bridge Village Phase 2 subdivision. The proposed plan connects with Phase 1 to the east via extensions of Burwell Street and Viking Street. There are 4 proposed intersections with Arthur Street to the west. The plan proposes 38 single detached dwellings, 50 townhouse dwellings, and a block for a pedestrian walkway that connects to Phase 1. Catch basins and storm sewers are proposed that will collect stormwater runoff from the subdivision. These catch basins will connect to storm sewers in Peace Bridge Village Phase 1. From there, the runoff will drain into the stormwater management facility that exists on Albany Street to the south. The town's official plan designates the subject property as commercial, urban residential, and environmental conservation. The northern portion of the site with commercial designation is proposed to change to urban residential to implement the proposed plan of subdivision. The urban residential land use designation permits a variety of residential dwelling types, including the single detached dwellings and street townhouse dwellings proposed by this application. This slide shows the natural heritage features on the subject property as identified on Schedule C of the town's official plan. The only natural heritage feature that is present on the subject property is woodlands over 2 hectares in size. This corresponds with the environmental conservation land use designation on the previous slide. An environmental impact study has been conducted and is currently under review by the town's Environmental Advisory Committee. The subject property is currently zoned Highway Commercial Holding C3H zone, Highway Commercial C3-55 zone, Neighborhood Development ND zone, and Environmental Conservation EC overlay zone, in accordance with Comprehensive Zoning Bylaw number 129-1990. The proposed zoning bylaw amendment will change the zoning of the property to site-specific residential 2A R2A zone and residential multiple 1 RM1 zone. The site-specific R2A zoning proposes a smaller lot area of 360 square meters. The R2A zone normally requires 375 square meters of lot area for single detached dwellings. The site-specific RM1 zoning proposes a smaller lot area and increased lot coverage for exterior street townhouse dwellings. The RM1 zone normally requires 270 square meters of lot area for exterior street townhouse dwellings and sets maximum lot coverage to 40%. This application proposes to reduce the minimum lot area of these units to 250 square meters and to increase the maximum lot coverage to 50%. I'd also like to point out there's a slight error in the recommendation report on page 10. It says the lot coverage is proposed to change from 50 to 60. The correct value is 40 to 50. So this is looking at the subject lands from 427 Garrison Road, which is the rear of the commercial plaza. This is looking west towards the subject lands on Viking Street. That's Arthur Street in the distance, and this is the roadway that connects Phase 1 to Arthur Street. This is looking east towards the subject lands from Arthur Street, and that's Viking Street. This public meeting is being held to obtain the opinion and view of area residents. A recommendation report will be submitted to council at a future date to consider any questions or concerns that are raised at this public meeting. This concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vanderveen. Any members of council have any questions? Mr. Vanderveen, Councillor Noyes.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I understand that in the study that was completed by, it said TPP concludes that all trees on the site require removal to implement the proposed, so none of the trees are going to be saved.
That is correct, and we will be receiving comments from the town's environmental advisory committee in regard to that preservation plan as well as the environmental impact study.
Okay, and one further question: the exterior, the area for the exterior street, like the square meters. You're going from 375 square meters to 360, right? For single detached dwellings?
That is correct.
And you're going from, and I think you made the, so how much how much yard is it going to be?
We've reviewed the planning justification report submitted by the agent. All required yards will be met as well as frontages, so the lots will be a little bit smaller, but otherwise they will meet all the other requirements of the R2A zoning.
Just one further question. I'm going to crystal ball gaze here. So you're not anticipating that sometime in the future we're going to be asked for, go from 12 feet to 6 feet as we're going down the road and we're getting closer to the actual building of the subdivision. We're not going to be inundated with requests for alterations.
Yeah, it's impossible to say. I don't believe so. This application is moving forward along with the plan of subdivision, so they will be both, move through the process at the same time, and the zoning is intended to implement the plan of subdivision that was submitted.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Any other councillors? Mr. Vanderveen, just to follow up then with respect to the zone comparison chart and the reference to the smaller lot sizes, but greater lot coverage for the houses. So you're understanding that the houses will be larger, or they'll simply require a greater lot coverage criterion because the lots will be smaller?
Yeah, the lot coverage only pertains to townhouses that are on the exterior lots, so those are townhouses on corner lots. The remainder of the townhouse units and all of the single detached dwelling units will meet, or they're under the standard lot coverage requirements.
Okay. And with respect to the portion of this property that's within the commercial zoning currently, my understanding is there needs to be a justification to change that from commercial to residential?
That is correct. Council approved a neighborhood plan in 2007. This plan is a little bit different, but the basic elements are the same, namely a mix of single detached dwellings and medium density townhouse units, as well as a connection from Viking Street to Arthur Street.
Does the neighborhood plan presume that this property would be utilized for residential?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So does anyone on behalf of any of the proponents wish to address council? And could we have your name and address for the record, please?
Yes, good evening, Mr. Mayor and Council. My name is William Heikup. I'm with Upper Canada Consultants and am representing the owners Ashton Homes, Park Lane Homes, and Delta Bingo Inc. Do have a brief presentation prepared for you this evening. Thank you, Daryl, for doing a good job of the overview. That was very helpful. I guess I can't add too much, but you have seen from his presentation where the subject site is, just south of Arthur Street, south of Garrison Road, east of Arthur Street, and west of Peace Bridge Village Phase 1. The subject lands are about 4.329 hectares in size. These Phase 2 lands comprise of 4 different properties that have been assembled by the owners. The reason why Delta Bingo Inc. is actually listed as an owner here, as we currently received approval and registered a consent application to sever the rear part of the bingo lands off of the bingo hall. So since the time of the application and this public meeting, that land has now been transferred to Ashton Homes, so that provides a little bit of clarity there. As you can see, there's the official plan designation. I think we've gone through the changes, but basically there's a commercial area. You can see on the left that is required to be changed. On the right, you can see the different C3, C3-55, and ND neighborhood development zones and the EC overlay. First off, the application for official plan amendment revises this commercial designation on the former bingo hall lands and 996 Arthur Street properties. You can see from this plan here that area that needs to be changed. The balance of the lands are designated as urban residential today. Here you can see a format of the proposed zoning bylaw amendment. The yellow color highlights the area for the R2A zone for the single detached dwellings, with the site-specific provision to reduce the minimum lot area from 375 square meters to 360 square meters. I'd like to point out at this time there's only about 4 lots that don't meet the 375 meter requirement. So it's just to accommodate several of them with some rear yard catch basin easements. The proposed townhouse dwelling units are to be zoned as RM1 and then shown in orange. The site-specific provision is for reduction in the corner units from 270 square meters to 250 square meters, and the lot coverage of those exterior townhouse dwellings from 40 to 50%. I'd like to point out that the interior units, the lot coverage under the existing bylaw is 60%. So what this change from 40 to 50% on the exterior units allows us to build the same size unit on the exterior as the interior. And as mentioned by staff, both these provisions will not negatively impact the neighboring properties and are to be considered compatible under provincial and local policy. Here you can see the proposed draft plan of subdivision that will link up with the existing street network. We'll see both Burwell and Viking Street connect to Arthur Street, with 2 new streets, Street A and Street B, small crescents that will connect from Viking Street into Arthur Street. Overall, the plan consists of 38 single detached dwellings, 50 street towns, all with frontage on these new streets. There is also 1 pedestrian connection from Street B through to Phase 1, and we'll link up with Burwell Street and cut the corner for pedestrians, making it a little bit quicker walk. The plan overall has a density of 20 units per hectare and 50 people and jobs per hectare, meeting the density targets and requirements for the proposed subdivision. To date, a lot of studies and design works have been undertaken for the proposed development. Aside from the land assembly, surveys have been completed, and ultimately a land titles absolutes application will be required for the subdivision. An environmental site assessment has been completed for the change in use of the commercial area to residential. A record of site condition has been obtained from the ministry on this. A functional servicing study and stormwater management report has been completed. In that report, it has demonstrated that there is existing servicing capacity for the site through the existing network. The swim stormwater management pond that was completed for phase 1 of the development was contemplated and was sized to be able to accommodate the additional flows from phase 2. An EIS and tree inventory preservation plan was completed for the site to review and assess the environmental impacts. The reports conclude that there is no significant impact to the natural heritage features or functions of the natural heritage system. Also, two other things that I think it's important to point out at this time is that the town staff has indicated that we're required to enter into a front-ending agreement with the town to reconstruct Arthur Street. And additionally, through the pre-consultation process, that they would require cash in lieu of 5% of the parkland dedication. So that's something that we expect, if approval does go forward, to be captured in the conditions of approval. I just wanted to show you briefly some of the proposed designs. We see some artist renderings from the Ashton Homes dwellings here. There is, I think, one of the beneficial things to this development is having two different builders in it, so you get a larger variety of styles of dwellings, which ultimately will contribute greatly to the streetscape and give you a little bit of a visual difference. Overall, we expect about more than 11 different models and different variations of that. So I just wanted to show those to you this evening. Overall, and just in summary, the applications are for an official plan amendment and zoning bylaw and draft plan of subdivision. Through these applications, a subdivision of 88 dwelling units is proposed, 38 single detached dwellings, 50 street townhouses. The plan provides a street network for vehicular and pedestrian connections. The built form is compatible with adjacent housing forms, permits desirable dwelling sizes, and includes a minimum of 2 parking spaces per dwelling unit. Furthermore, the development can be supported by full municipal services and the existing stormwater management pond on Albany. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Or try to.
Any members of council? Mr. Haikoop, I just have, interestingly enough, we have a housing needs study presentation this evening. We'll be going through an exercise to determine how we can, as a municipality, encourage some affordable housing. And we haven't gotten to the point where we've got the policies in place yet. But in terms of the size of the units that are going to be constructed, I looked, as you had flashed, the elevations for some of the houses. They look like the smallest one is maybe around 1,400 square feet, and then they get larger. Presumably that's all based on some type of market research by the builder?
Yes, that's correct. At this point in time, Ashton Homes has been developing phase 1, and they've been very successful there. They've also done Spears Estates, so I think there's a combination of both those subdivisions that they've done in town that they want to implement in this phase of development. They've done some townhomes over in Spears Estates that we think would work well here. Park Lane Homes, as I'm sure you all know, I've been very active in Fort Erie as well, with some of their, the portion that Park Lane Homes would end up owning in this case is the 3 townhouse blocks on the north side. So we would expect to see something similar from some of their other developments, Village Creek Phase 3 or Park Lane Place.
Okay, thank you. If there are no other questions, thank you. I'll ask if there's anyone who wishes to speak in favor of the applications.
Thank you.
Is there anyone who wishes to speak in opposition to the applications? Please come forward, sir. Could we have your name and address for the record, please?
My name is George Wiseman. My address is 311 Helena Street in Fort Erie here.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Your Worship and councillors. I don't have specific items except for maybe parks or something to talk about with this specific development. I want to address an issue that has to do with both of the developments and quite a few other developments that have been happening around town, and bring this to the council's attention, if I may, please. I prepared a statement here because I'd rather read. I came from the backwoods of BC, and I grew up on a cattle ranch where if we needed to build something, we just built it. And we built it well because we were building it for ourselves. I got quite a shock when I moved to town and discovered all the rules, regulations, fees, inspections. But I dutifully followed the rules because that was the reality of my new home. And I could see that the people building for themselves, who are not building for themselves, will cut corners and make inappropriate decisions if not held to a standard. So I could see that. And a case in point, the police pulled me over recently, asked me if I knew why they pulled me over, and I said no, because I didn't know. And he said, "You didn't stop at that four-way stop behind you." And so I was in the wrong. I knew I was in the wrong. Everyone knows you stop at a stop sign. It didn't matter that I'd looked and no one was coming. It didn't matter that I maybe hadn't been stopping at that stop sign for 10 years. There's no grandfathered thing about not following the rules. So I was in the wrong. I was supposed to stop. And that time I got caught. So the rules are there for everyone. And the society works if everyone follows the rules. So as a society, we make and agree on the rules that govern everyone. And it doesn't matter if someone has been breaking the rules for years, it matters that the rules get followed at some point.
Mr. Lasman, I'm reluctant to interrupt you, but this is a public meeting to deal with these applications.
Yes.
Under the Planning Act. So
Yes.
I wonder if we could maybe get to the
We're getting to it right now. The town of Fort Erie planning and development staff has been breaking the rules for years. And this is my opinion based on research I've been doing over the last couple of years. And I'll get to that a little bit more as this proceeds. So these development applications that are brought to you today, both of them, and several that have happened in the past, and I suspect ones that would happen in the future, have been not following a rule that they should be following, in my opinion, and the opinion of city planners and lawyers that I've hired. So I think that they don't follow this particular rule that I'm going to point out to you today because they want to take advantage of the recent housing prices, development booms and everything, and they want to get things done. But rules are made to be followed, are they not? So it's my understanding the town staff works for town council. It's my understanding, I may be wrong. And town council approves or denies the development applications from town staff. And the town council represents the people and are supposed to follow the rules that the people that represent them. So I feel that the town staff has been depending on ignorance, trust, and apathy of the people of Fort Erie and town council.
Mr. Lisman,
Yes.
you're making allegations that so far you haven't directed us to the rule that you're saying is being broken. There's a specific rule. So if it relates to this hearing,
Okay.
please get to that point, because I'm not really interested in having you say comments about staff that may or may not be accurate. So if you've got some points that you wish to raise and you can direct us to some specifics, I would ask you to please do that.
Yes, Your Worship. Okay, so previous town councils have built into the town of Fort Erie official plan a specific stop sign, which is why I used that particular story earlier, that made it imperative to not do large developments until neighborhood plans were in place. The particular part of the official plan that I'm directing your attention to is 4.7.4.1. The town will develop a neighborhood plan for each neighborhood prior to considering large-scale development applications that may have a significant impact on the neighborhood in which they're intended to develop. So this is a stop sign that has been being bypassed, and in my opinion, and in the planners that I've hired. So I understand that there's no provision in the official plan to bypass the requirement of a neighborhood plan, and I'm going to skip over some of the things just to speed things up as we're doing here. I'll give this full report to you so you can read it at your leisure, and I'll just hit the highlights now as I can see that and I don't want to repeat this twice for both developments, so I'm requesting that the town put this report with both developments that are in being presented today. Okay, so it's my understanding that no large development application should ever make it past the town staff pre-consultation meeting, let alone make it here to town council, because the rules that would be defined in the neighborhood plan still don't exist. So the development can't be held to a standard that doesn't yet exist. So the neighborhood plan has to be in place first before the large development can even be evaluated. Else, you may be doing things that would contravene what the plan would be without even knowing it. So the plan has to be in place. So the town staff can't legally, in my opinion, accept a large development application without the neighborhood plan, and the staff doesn't make the rules, they're employees. The staff must follow the rules, and a large development, for example, is defined in the provincial building codes that are referenced by the Town of Fort Erie official plan to be exceeding 3 stories and or exceeding 600 square meters. Of course, current town staff has personally, to my face, denied this and doesn't want to bother to define large development. And this is one of the big issues with, for example, the Harbour Town development, because it was premature. I'm not saying anything against the developments. Please believe me. I actually think a lot of these developments are really good. But I think that they may be, and in my experience with the development directly across the street from me, doing things that are inappropriate for the neighborhood and would contravene a neighborhood plan if it was in place. So I think we should be looking at quality over quantity, and it's the opposite right at the moment. So the current town staff, in my opinion, is using what's called a secondary plan, a provincial secondary plan procedure to get around the requirement of the neighborhood plan. And it goes like this. A neighborhood plan is a secondary plan according to the definition of the Provincial Planning Act. But a neighborhood plan, as per the official plan of Town of Fort Erie, is more restrictive. It has more rules. And according to the law, the most restrictive rules, if there's 2 things that overlap, the most restrictive applies. So the staff has been using things like they'll notify within 120 meters of a particular development as per the provincial requirements, but the Town of Fort Erie neighborhood plan requirement would be to notify every single person in that neighborhood, just as an example. You can't make a neighborhood plan without notifying everybody in the neighborhood, and you can't do something in the neighborhood which is going to affect the neighborhood plan without notifying every single person in the neighborhood. And
Mr. Wiseman, you've made your point with respect to neighborhood plans and where it should fit into the planning process here. You've not really addressed one issue relative specifically, other than that, to this application.
Okay,
So if
specific.
you have something that you would like to address specifically, we'd like to hear that.
Okay, specific to this application would be parks, for example. Just like when I was here with and talking with the 613 Helena Street and talked about the access to along the road, that they're going for, in this particular case, the park having the 5% thing, which is legal according to the official plan. But a neighborhood plan might say, you're putting in enough houses there, there's going to be children, there should be parks, for example. And the neighborhood plans, I believe, should be a priority for town council and direct the staff to do that so that we could get on with getting all these developments in place correctly. So that being said, and I'm not wanting to take a lot of the people's time, I will make this this presentation. I'll ask if it gets put with the things, and you can look at it and what have you. I'll finally say that I note the town of Fort Erie has a whistleblower policy that that says we are committed to the well-being of our community. We're open, honest, and value trust and integrity. We listen with sensitivity and respect. And I just want to ask if this is true because I'm not an employee of the town, and I'm wondering what happens if a resident is talking about things that the town employees, and I have quite a few stories about my personal interaction with town employees, and it hasn't been nice.
Okay, Mr. Wiseman, you're way off base now. So can you just stick to the purpose of the public meeting, please?
I'll tie this up or finish this off by saying I'm willing to discuss this in more detail if you would be willing to make a committee or some sort of a time that we could get together with talking about this particular aspect. Thank you for your time. I can answer any questions.
Thank you, and you did indicate that you'll provide a copy of your presentation.
I will indicate that, yes. And I will also say quickly that it was when I was going over the paperwork for this particular public meeting that we're talking about right now with the Peace Bridge plan, that it looked to me like the approved portion of the Garrison neighborhood was stops at Concession and didn't actually cover the area that we're talking about here. So I just would want you councillors to please check into that because I may be wrong about that. Any other thing?
No. Are there any members of council that have any questions of Mr. Wiseman? Councillor Lubberts.
Yes, thank you very much, Mayor Redekop. Thank you very much for coming forward. I think I remember when you came forward with the Helena Street, and I have a tendency to agree with you. But you mentioned that this year plan of subdivision doesn't meet the criteria because we don't have a secondary plan.
You don't have a neighborhood plan?
Neighborhood plan.
Yes, correct.
And you mentioned Harbor Town, and you mentioned another one. But
Yes.
you said there was others.
There are others.
Could you provide us with the others? that you
In
feel
the
are
report, I have
violated?
I have the references
Oh,
to some of the
they're in
others.
there? Okay, all right, thank you.
And if we put together a meeting, I can make a longer list.
Okay, thank you.
Any other councillors have any other questions? Thank you very much, Mr. Wiseman. And will you deliver a hard copy or will you be?
I have 9 hard copies right here, and I have an electronic copy in my pocket that I can do if you, okay?
Great, thank you very much. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak in opposition to the application before us this evening? If not, then I'm going to declare this public meeting closed. Sorry. Yes, please come forward. And we'll need your name and address for the records, sir.
Thank you, Your Worship. My name is Jeff Moore. I live in Niagara Falls, Ontario. I'm here to represent the owner of the property that is
What's your address in Niagara Falls?
6694 Ryle Street, L2J1Z6. I'm not really opposing anything. I just have something that was drawn to my attention. After attending the meeting in the atrium outside the chambers last week, or I guess it was 2 weeks ago now. Okay, just bear with me for 1 second. So we'll be talking about the property on adjacent to the phase 2 of the, I need my glasses. I'm sorry, Your Worship. Yes, I'm representing the owner that owns the 3.2 acres, which are directly adjacent to the phase 2, which is on the east side of Arthur Street. And I'm sorry, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. Actually, I just got this off the copy from the city today. And the thing that was kind of bothered me was that they have that designated as, it was zoned as ND for neighborhood development, and now they have on their proposed parkland.
Do you have a question about that?
Yes, I do. I was just wondering, like, we would have, like, I don't have all the stuff, this, because I said this, I just got this today. But will there be another meeting? Will we have time to address that?
There won't be another meeting with respect to this particular matter, and technically speaking, I believe that the parcel that you're referring to isn't part of this plan.
No, it's not, sir. It's, Your Worship, it's adjacent.
It's immediately south and west of,
It is, it's on the east side of Arthur,
right,
and it would be right, it backs onto to phase 2 of the other development there, the Peach Bridge.
correct. And I understand your concern is that it's designated on one of these appendices to the report as a proposed future neighborhood park.
Correct.
Well, you won't, whoever owns that land would have to, first of all, make it available to the municipality. And as far as I know, that hasn't happened yet. But we'll ask staff about that.
Okay, great. And I'll have to have some conversation with my,
This is an issue that you've raised, and it will be part of the public meeting and will have to be addressed by staff.
thanks, Your Worship. That's all I ask.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Any questions of the delegate? Thank you very much, sir.
Good, thank you.
Anyone else who wishes to speak in opposition or ask any questions about this particular application? Please come forward, ma'am. Good evening. Well, my understanding is that it's not actually part of this application. It's outside the boundaries of the lands that we're dealing with tonight, so that whatever, I believe, is that correct, Mr. Vanderveen?
Yeah, that's my understanding as well.
Okay, so it's not really subject to anything that's going to be happening this evening because it's not part of the application.
Okay, I was wondering if there's any plan for any future neighborhood parks, because in phase 1 development, the 5% was bought and, was, I believe, given to the town, or the town received the money for the parkland instead of having a park in the phase 1 development.
Well, that could very well be. And so that's an issue that you've raised a concern about. Instead of accepting 5% of the value of the lands in lieu of parkland dedication, you're suggesting the town should consider parkland for a neighborhood park.
Yes,
Okay.
because there is families already in that area, and if they're projecting phase 2, where is the closest park to this area?
That's something that staff can advise us on when we get to the report aspect, which is a little later in the evening.
Okay. That's all.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions of Mrs. Everett? Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Is there anyone else who wishes to address council with respect to this application? Please come forward, sir. Good evening.
Good evening. My name's Al Humphrey from 1010 Arthur Street. I see on the plan up there, they're gonna extend that road that runs behind the bingo hall that they've got cut off now. And I'm wondering, is there gonna be townhouses backed up on the side of my property? My property is right at 1010 Arthur. And they'll be cutting right across the bingo hall parking lot, right adjacent to my property, on the east side, Arthur.
I don't see, what I see at the top of that is townhouses backing onto.
1010 Arthur, my property line runs right along there.
Looks like townhouses that'll be facing Burwell Street.
Burwell?
Burwell, which will be an east-west street south of your property.
Okay. I'm also wondering now, are they gonna be building that up at all on their property, like raising the ground? Because that has a natural grade that comes from the Garrison down Arthur.
So you have a drainage issue.
We have a drainage issue there, yes. About 3 years ago, the road committee come in and they put tiles under our driveways. They redone them. But what they did, they removed manholes. And right now, I have a drainage problem of the water running into my driveway. And now, if that is all gonna be down below me, is gonna be higher than what I am, I'm gonna get more water there on my property.
Right, so we've been told by the developer that there's going to be some reconstruction of Arthur Street. And we can find out from the staff when we get to the report what that's going to involve. You've raised drainage as an issue and concern here in the public meeting, so it will have to be addressed by staff when they make their next report to us with respect to this matter.
Okay, thank you.
Before you go, any questions of Mr. Humphrey? Thank you very much, sir.
Thanks.
Is there anyone else who wishes to address council with respect to this public meeting? Then, if not, I'm going to declare this public meeting closed. As I said, there is a information report in our agenda this evening, which council will be dealing with a little later on. The next usual steps are for council to deal with this and then for staff to hear what was said during the course of the public meeting and respond to questions that have been raised by the public and by councilors, and then provide us with a further report at some point down the road. Okay, that then takes us to the second public meeting, which is an official plan amendment and property rezoning for property currently owned by the regional municipality of Niagara at 745 Crescent Road, former site of a water tower. Mr. Kernahan, I take it you're up?
Yes, Your Worship. Thank you, Your Worship, and good evening, members of council. This public meeting relates to an application for a combined official plan and zoning bylaw amendment that was submitted by Pam Salvatore on behalf of the region of Niagara, who are the owners of the former water tower site located at 745 Crescent Road. The water tower that was formerly located on the site has recently been decommissioned, and the region plans on declaring the property as surplus to their needs and marketing it for sale. The purpose of this application is to redesignate the former water tower site from institutional to urban residential and to rezone the property from a public zone to a residential multiple one zone. The amendments will permit a variety of residential dwelling types to be developed on the site, including single detached dwellings, semi-detached dwellings, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, street and block townhouse dwellings, and uses and buildings accessory to those. Notification of this public meeting was provided by placing an ad in the October 17th, 2019 edition of the Post. In addition, property owners living within 120 meters were provided notice on that same date. This is an aerial photograph of the subject property as well as the surrounding neighborhood area. The subject property is located on the west side of Crescent Road, north of Phillips Street in the Crescent Park neighborhood. Following land uses surround the subject property. To the north are single detached dwellings and vacant residential lands. To the south are vacant residential lands as well as single detached dwellings. To the east is Crescent Road and single detached dwellings. And to the west is an unopened portion of Fairview Road and vacant residential lands. This slide shows a survey plan of the property. The property is a rectangular parcel, which is a through lot, meaning it has frontage on 2 streets. The lot has approximately 36 meters or 120 feet of frontage on Crescent Road, as well as a portion of Fairview Road, which is not opened. The site is approximately 2,700 square meters, or about 2/3 of an acre. Oops. The town developed a number of development concepts for the subject property to demonstrate how the site might be developed in the future, given the proposed zoning. All development concepts adhere to the setbacks, lot size, and building coverage permissions of the proposed residential multiple, or RM1 zone. This first concept shows the site developed for 6 single detached dwellings, each with approximately 40 feet of frontage. This concept would require the developer to extend the road and municipal services northward across the Fairview Street frontage of the property. The second concept is for 4 duplex dwellings for a total of 8 units. This concept meets the RM1 requirements and would also require the extension of the roadway and services up Fairview Street. This last concept shows the site developed for 8 street townhouse dwellings, all of which meet the RM1 requirements for lot dimensions. As before, Fairview Street and municipal services would be required to be extended at the cost to the developer in order to implement this concept. The town's official plan designates the property as institutional. Properties designated this way are intended to be used for public uses and operations carried out by or on behalf of the town of Fort Erie, Region of Niagara, or other government agencies. The region has recently decommissioned the water tower located on the site and no longer requires the site for utility purposes. Instead, as I mentioned, the region plans to market the site for sale. Based on the site's location on a local road within a residential neighborhood, it was determined that the use of the site for residential purposes is most appropriate. The region therefore requested that the official plan designation of the property be changed from institutional to urban residential. Section 4.7.4 of the official plan permits a wide range of residential uses to be developed in this designation. Subject property is currently zoned public zone. The public zone permits public uses and operations carried out by or on behalf of the town of Fort Erie, Region of Niagara, or other government agency. The region has applied to rezone the property to residential multiple 1 zone, which permits a variety of residential uses, including single detached, semi-detached, duplex, triplex, fourplex, and townhouse dwellings. This slide just shows the natural heritage features in the vicinity of the subject property. As you can see, there are no natural heritage features on the site or immediately adjacent to it. This is a very recent view of the subject property looking west from Crescent Road. And this is looking east from Fairview Road, from an unopened portion of it. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kernahan. Do any members of council have any questions? Councillor Noyes.
Thank you, Mayor Redekop, to Mr. Kernahan. Was there ever a consideration for an apartment building?
Through Mr. Mayor, Councillor Noyes, there has been some consideration for an apartment building. In fact, you'll read in the report, our neighborhood planner thought that we might give that some consideration. The region has applied for the RM1 zoning, which staff believe is a good balance between, what was there and what is there in Crescent Park, which is a very much predominantly, if not entirely, single detached dwelling filled neighborhood. So the answer is yes, we have considered it and are considering it.
Okay, thank you. If I can continue.
Yes.
In that particular area, Crescent Park, there was a lot of flooding in the past. I don't think the flooding is happening as much as it happened in the past. I think there's been a huge improvement in infrastructure and stuff, but the flooding in Crescent Park was a big problem not that many years ago. How is this development going to address that?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, my recollection from when I first started here about 8 years ago is that flooding problem was rectified by the region with a significant infrastructure project which went in under Garrison Road in terms of a large trunk sewer. So sewer capacity is no longer an issue in this area.
Okay, thank you.
Any other councillors? Councillor Butler?
Thank you, Your Worship. Hello, Mr. Kernahan, how are you?
Good evening, I'm well, and how are you?
Good, good. I was just wondering, the Fairview Road, is that going to then be turned into an open road, or?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, any developer who would develop this site would be responsible to build it to a urban cross-section across the frontage of the property which they own. And then they would stop there.
Okay. That's all I have for you, thank you.
Any other councillors? Thank you very much, Mr. Kernahan. Is there anyone here that you're aware of from the region that's going to address this?
Ms. Salvatore is here, if
Perfect.
you please.
Please come forward if you wish. Good evening. And can we have your name?
Pam Salvatore, Real Estate Coordinator, Niagara Region.
Thank you. Please proceed.
I just wondered if you had any questions about this?
Can you stick with Mr. Kernahan's explanation?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Are there any questions of Ms. Salvatore? There being none, Councillor Lubberts.
Yes, thank you very much. The mayor had mentioned earlier that we haven't got anything in place in the town here yet, but we're looking for some affordable housing. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if that's been given any consideration for this property.
Through our disposal of land bylaw, we do distribute it to all departments of the region, including the agencies, boards, and commissions. Mm-hmm. And none of the departments or the ABCs indicated any interest in the property. The Niagara Regional Housing thought that the property was too small for their needs, so they did not. We do have an affordable housing working group that will be addressing surplus residential land in one of their upcoming meetings.
Thank you. I'm just curious as to, Matt has indicated that having the property be used as an apartment building, what's the difference between an apartment building and something that would be classified as affordable housing? So what's the difference? Could you explain that?
I'm not with the Niagara Regional Housing Group. I'm with the real estate group, and unfortunately, I don't have that answer for you. I could take it back to the region and ask.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Any other members of the council have any questions of Ms. Salvatore? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there anyone here who wishes to speak in favor of the application presented this evening? Is there anyone who wishes to speak in opposition to the application or ask council questions? Please come forward, sir. Good evening, Reverend Thomas. We need your name and address.
Yes. So Reverend William Thomas, 4065 Village Creek Drive in Stevensville. And I'm not speaking in favor or against this application or the last application, but just picking up on Councillor Lubberts' question, I'm wondering why it's an either or. So it sounded to me like it was either going to be an apartment building or it was going to be affordable housing, or it's going to be market, or it's going to be affordable housing. And as far as I know, much of the research coming out of CMHC and a variety of other places suggests that that's absolutely the wrong way to be looking at it. And to find opportunities for for mixed housing, where you would have market rate housing in the same location as affordable or subsidized housing. And I'm wondering why that wouldn't be part of the consideration when projects like this are moving forward, where private developers can be encouraged and even incentivized to incorporate affordable subsidized housing into what is also a market situation. So I'm probably going to be speaking to this again at in other times and other places, but really I think that the town, but also the region, should be thinking about ways that can happen. And I also know, because of some recent work that I was doing in St. Catharines, that some of that responsibility falls on the town and some of it falls on the region, and that the municipalities and the region don't actually talk about this kind of stuff. And I think that really improving conversation, improving communication between the various levels of government, including the province, I guess, would probably make living out whatever is going to come out as an affordable housing policy and way forward, it would make it much more reasonable and doable if the various levels of government were speaking to each other with specific attention to that aspect of our community development.
So before you go,
Yep.
those are welcome comments, but let me unbundle a little bit of what you've said. So first of all, about the lack of communication. In fact, we have an affordable housing committee that does dialogue with the region with respect to the things that they're doing. And the delegation that we're going to receive tonight with respect to this housing needs study has done work not only for the town of Fort Erie, but also for the regional municipality of Niagara. So there is dialogue that's going on, and there are certain responsibilities for each. In terms of whether this would be affordable housing, whether there would be a combination of subsidized units and market units, whatever, you're a little bit ahead of the process here. This process is to rezone the property from public zone because of the water tower that was located on it to housing. And so now we're just trying to get what's the proper housing zoning for this particular parcel. Then if it's sold or utilized by the region, they can determine what the mix might be, and then we would have another process that we would be looking at. So you're on the mark in terms of your vision with respect to the overall housing issues. On this particular application, you're slightly ahead of the process.
So Your Worship, I was just picking up on Councillor Lubberts' question and the response, right? That it appeared to me, or it seemed to me in the response, that it was one or the other. And therefore, I just sort of wanted to raise the possibility of something more imaginative. And just to answer, or to respond to your first point, I know that when I was in St. Catharines 4 years ago, and the city of St. Catharines was looking at offering incentives for the development particularly along St. Paul Street, for second floor and third floor, turning it into residential. When I raised the question with the city whether they had considered doing any measure of affordable housing, their response to me was that that's not the city's responsibility, it's the region's responsibility. And when I raised the question about, well, why does that breakdown in communication not result in not even thinking about it, the response was, well, we've actually never thought about it. So I'm just encouraging you, as the town and as the region, to consider things that are slightly more imaginative than it's either an apartment building or affordable housing.
So Mr. Thomas, just for clarification, when you say the city, are you talking about the city of St. Catharines?
Yes, yes.
Okay, because they, as the town of Fort Erie, as a number of other municipalities, we have what are called community improvement programs, and there is in fact money to assist owners to create rental units on the second story of downtown commercial buildings. So we do have that. There may be an issue as to how affordable they are, but that's the whole purpose of the Affordable Housing Committee and obtaining the housing needs study. So some of your concerns are being addressed as you speak. Certainly, there's a lot more work that needs to be done, and I would encourage you to continue to help keep us focused on that. Now, before you go,
Absolutely.
any members of council that have any questions of Reverend Thomas? Thank you very much, sir.
You're welcome.
Is there anyone else who wishes to address council with respect to this particular public meeting? If not, then I'm going to declare this public, oh, please come forward, ma'am. Good evening.
Gayleen Archibald, 755 Crescent Road. Now, this vacant lot is directly beside us. We've been here since June of last year. And I believe it was February or March, the region had work done on the lot, drainage issue, in the amount of like $30,000. So my first question is, after spending all of that money, now they're going to redevelop this lot?
No, what they're doing is they're asking for a zoning change.
Yes,
so that
yes.
So that if it's granted, the property could be sold for housing.
Okay, yeah, I understand that, but my first question is, why would you spend that money and then sell the property off to build on? That, I was just a little confused about that. Do you know what the lot next to it that is for sale is zoned?
Well, I'm sure it's zoned residential of some sort. If
Okay,
it's in a residential neighborhood.
I'm ignorant as to the facts here. Is all residential zoning the same type?
No, there are different types of residential zoning. Some provide for single-family dwellings only. Some provide for multiple units. They could be townhouses, they could be duplexes, could be something further. And then there's a zoning that could allow apartment buildings, as an example.
Okay, so I guess what I need to understand at this point is that once this approval has been given for the zoning application and the property is sold, is there any recourse as to, at that point, what is being built?
So the zoning that will eventually be applicable to this parcel will determine the range of what could be built there.
Okay.
Once that's been approved, if someone comes in and builds in accordance with what they're permitted to build, we simply receive the application for a building permit and they build. So if you have concerns about what might be permitted to be built there, this is the time when you would speak.
Okay, so yes, I know that for myself and my husband, we are opposed to townhouses, triplexes, anything other than your single-family dwelling. I mean, the entire Crescent Park is single-family dwellings. Our property values reflect the type of neighborhood that it is, and it's really not something that, like an apartment building or townhouses, is not something that we want to live beside. Okay? Thank you for your time.
Before you go, any members of council have any questions? Thank you very much, Ms. Archibald.
Okay. I do have one more question. When you had the meeting a few weeks ago, and several neighbors attended the meeting and voiced their concerns, where do those comments get recorded?
Was that a meeting with respect to this specific property?
Yes, it was.
So that's referred to in the report, and they are taken into account when staff hears everything that was said during this public meeting, during that open house, and then comes back to us with a report as to what their recommendations are in terms of how this application should be dealt.
Okay, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome. Is there anyone else who wishes to? Yes, please come forward, ma'am. Good evening.
Good evening. My name is Rajan Asselin, Asselin, 330 Helena Street. And I'm opposed for high rises almost anywhere in the town of Fort Erie. You are trying to build one now across from my property. The neighborhood is all against it. I think it might be nice if you would make like a kind of voting referendum on the population, on what the whole population wants for future planning in Fort Erie, because I think people that want to come in are going to be mostly elderly people. A lot of people from Toronto and those areas are trying to move here. And they like the little houses and the properties where they have room and leisure and space. And all these multiple apartment buildings is not Fort Erie. We're not Toronto. We want to keep our little town, quaint and beautiful. And even my property is not the best. I'm handicapped. I can't maintain it as much as I would like to. But I think it might, for most of the properties, if the town would stop doing those high rises, would be appreciated from a lot of the residents. A lot of the people I talk to, everybody's against having high rises. Might be you should, before you do all your planning, take a vote and have people either do it over the internet or call in on what they would like to have for future planning of Fort Erie.
I'm sure Ms. Aslan, you'll be very interested in the housing needs study comments that you're going to hear a little later on this evening if you.
We have so much land. I mean, single houses or maybe a duplex, but when you start talking above 3 stories, I'm losing, if the project goes through, aside from my house, I'm on the north side of that building. I have lost all the sunshine. In the winter, there is no sun coming into my house whatsoever. My windows are all on the south side. I've lost everything. My little garden and all that in the backyard.
Ms. Aslan, I've got to keep you focused on this application.
Well, this is what I'm trying to say for other people that don't realize if you're putting up more than 3 stories, what's going to happen to their properties. I'm speaking of experience, what I'm going through now. And most of the people in Fort Erie are not for multiple or high rises in Fort Erie. We want to keep them short and quaint and make the neighborhoods look all the same. If you want to put high rises, set a special area and say, okay, this area is going to be all for apartment buildings, and then throw them all in one corner. Don't put them in Crescent Park. It doesn't belong in Crescent Park, apartment building. It's all beautiful little houses, single-family homes. That's what I think.
Thank you. Any members of council have any questions of Ms. Aslan? Councillor Dubanow.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship, and thank you very much for coming up and speaking. I do appreciate your comments. I know you had mentioned you didn't want high rises in town. Is that correct?
Yeah, nothing above 3 stories.
So you sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but that just piqued a thought. You consider 3 stories a high rise?
Well, I consider 3 stories pretty high. The 3rd story, people can start looking into your houses.
Okay.
Second story, you can kind of even things off. But once you're at a 3rd story, they're up there. They can look directly. If I want to walk around in my bathing suit in my house, I should have the right to do that without having to watch out for the neighbor up there that's going to be peeking through my windows.
Okay. Fair enough. And if I could ask one more question, Your Worship. You had mentioned earlier about elderly people in town and how we have a lot of seniors coming in from Toronto. Now, you mentioned that you're concerned about apartments, but if we have an elderly person or a senior in town who is at a point in their life where they don't want to cut a lawn anymore, they don't want to shovel snow.
There is some people, but don't put them in a residential area. But like I said, make a section, separate a special section for high rises. And just there in that area, like you did somewhere around Concession, you have 3 apartment buildings that are there in the surrounding area. So you make yourself a little area and you say, okay, this area is going to be for apartment buildings. As long as there's not tons of residential houses, I'm not opposed to that, and I think a lot of people wouldn't mind. But we don't want to see apartment buildings coming up in our neighborhoods where we have, pretty little houses with their nice little gardens, and stuff. And then you have parking problems and, all kinds of stuff to come into the scene. So that's my opinion.
Yeah, so I get the idea that from what I'm hearing here, you like the idea of apartments, just not in your neighborhood. Is
Not
that
in
correct?
any neighborhoods that are already established as single-home neighborhoods. Set a section aside for them and then build yourself a bunch of 10-story
We've heard
apartments.
that. We've heard that.
I'm good, Your Worship. Thank you.
Councillor Noyes.
Thank you, Mayor Redekop, to the speaker. Did you attend the neighborhood plan process that happened, I think, in Crescent Park? I'm pretty sure there was one.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't. No. I just came today to support one of my neighbors that was supposed to come and speak. And then we had discussed that at our meeting we had last night about this property, actually. And I came in late and I heard what was kind of going on, and I just wanted to input my thing. And I just want to say that a lot of people who I talk to, a lot of people are against having a lot of apartment buildings and residentials. Maybe, make a referendum, put a big ad in the paper and have people call in and say what they think.
Well,
Anything further, Councillor Noyes?
no,
Keep
I'll
meeting
end
as
that.
forward?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms.
Good night.
Ms. Aslan. Is there anyone else who wishes to address council? Please come forward. Good evening.
Good evening.
We do need your name and address for the record.
Gail Taylor at 756 Crescent Road, across the street from Gay here. I just wanted to confirm, I did attend the original opening meeting a couple weeks ago, and I also have expressed that I would rather much see a single-family dwelling. Again, I know Crescent Park used to be the big place to go to, but Crescent Park is getting older now. It's not the big area where everyone wanted to go move to like it was years ago. But yeah, the whole park is single dwelling, and it just seems to me it'd be kind of a misfit by putting multiple buildings in an area like this. So to this woman's remarks, I also agree with that. Like, you don't want to start putting mix match housings in an area. So that's the only comment I wanted to make.
Thank you. Any members of council have any questions? Thank you very much, Ms. Taylor.
Okay.
Anyone else who wishes to address? We've gone through almost the whole audience, so, except for staff, and they're not allowed to come up and address us. If there's no one else that wishes to address us on this issue, then I'm going to declare this public meeting closed, and I'm going to move then to the consent agenda. Do we have a mover for the consent agenda? Councillor Zanko? Are there any questions? I guess I should have asked, does anyone want any of the reports removed from the consent agenda? No, so Councillor Zanko has moved the consent agenda. Are there any questions of any of the reports contained therein? Councillor Noyes?
Thank you, Mayor Redekop. I have a few of some of the reports. On PDS 67-2019, the Development Services Building and Bylaw Statistical Reporting.
Yep.
One of the concerns that really jumped out at me is the price increase for the most affordable, which was the townhouses, went from $249, I think, to $349. The increase was over $100,000 in 1 year, but yet the single houses only went up $9,000. So I think we really, I don't know how we're ever going to get ahead of the problem when an increase of $100,000 in the most affordable housing occurs. That's almost a 70% increase, which is unbelievable. And also in that report, it talks about, almost like on a positive note, and I know it is positive, but about how the new houses that are being built have high-end finishes and have all these wonderful things. Well, sometimes we need to encourage not those high-end finishes so that the price itself can be more affordable. Kind of talks about that that's a good thing, and sometimes it can have a negative effect too, because it just increases the price of the house. Now, in regards to the bylaw part, which is also part of this, I'm just wondering, the noise bylaw, the noise complaints and things like that, did any of them have to do with any of the Airbnbs? I know there's a slight increase, but I didn't really kind of get into any detail of the nature of the noise complaints and the waste and debris complaints.
So I see Mr. Brady shaking his head. That means he either doesn't know or there weren't any related to short-term rentals. Mr. Brady?
There were, through the mayor, there were very, very, very few complaints about short-term rentals this year. Very few.
Thank you.
Far more about, single-family homes and neighbors and those kinds of things.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to move on to report number IS 39 2019, the extension of the contract for the conventional transit service. I'm hoping that if we extend this, I know we had talked about this in council, that we're hoping that there'll be some consideration to smaller buses in the routes that just don't have the ridership that has there. And I saw the increase in the potential increase in the cost per hour from, I think, $50 or $60 to $80 to $90 an hour, because they're not getting the revenue they had hoped for when they first did the contract. I would wonder that if the reduced trips to Stevensville and Black Creek may bring down some of those costs. And I agree with the reduction in the number of trips, but I'm just wondering how that may affect the cost.
Mr. Walsh, do you have any immediate comments with respect to the two items raised by Councillor Noyes?
I do have a comment on the first point about the smaller buses. We have talked to our transit provider about that already. We just recently rejigged our routes. He looked into a smaller bus. There's really not that much difference cost in operating. The current buses we have, the 40-footers, with a smaller bus, and he added that the smaller buses don't stand up to the wear and tear that our current buses do. Our current buses are made for stopping and starting all the time. The smaller buses, which are built on a van body, are not really built for that.
Wasn't there also an issue about interchanging the buses from routes to routes? So that if you had buses all the same size, they could be interchangeable if required?
Yes, he did add that at the beginning of the meeting, I believe. With respect to the price of the contract, it's in negotiation, pending approval of this, and we'll report back on costs. I would note that the current cost we're incurring has a revenue component to it that the transit operator keeps. The second cost we've noted there is just an operating cost with no revenue considerations.
Councillor Noyes?
Yeah, thank you. I have another question on report number IS 4029, the Prospect Point South Storm Drainage Contract. There was again, in the report it talked about what they were going to do, and I'm just wondering if the recent storm has caused caused problems with this particular, because they were talking about retaining walls and things like that. Has the recent storm perhaps changed?
Mr. Walsh, would you know anything about that?
Knowing a little bit about the design proposed, I wouldn't think it's required. I don't believe that the area that this outlet serves got flooded. A temporary submersion of the outlet near the lake will not affect anything in the immediate short term.
Thank you.
Any other councillors? Councillor Butler?
Oops, the mic is falling apart here.
Are you on? Yeah? No, we can't hear you. So, would you lose? Let's see if we get it.
Sorry about that. So just to further what Councillor Noyes was speaking with result. Sorry. Respect to the building bylaw, I just wanted to comment that I agree with Councillor Noyes. It's kind of unnerving to know that the housing prices in 1 year jumped as high as it did, and it'll be interesting to hear about the housing study and some suggestions on how we can try to mitigate that with future plans. But I did notice that in this report, I believe on page 5, there was an interesting point that you made in the report that that related to $9 million for new marijuana-related permits, and I just wondered if you could tell us what that entailed.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm just looking on page 5 of 8. Is that where you're?
27 on our report, but it's about the permit activity in the industrial sector.
Okay, and
Traditionally low numbers in the third quarter, and aside from last year's $9 million for new marijuana-related permits in Q3.
that's right.
So that kind of piqued my interest because this is the first I've heard of those types of revenues. And are those revenues that are actually being brought into the town or
No.
just being spent in the marketplace?
Through you, Mayor Redekop, to Councillor Butler, this would be the value of the permit, value of the construction that was going on. So the buildings and the foundations, if I recall, this particular permit was for all the foundation work that was out there on the House Road area up in Stevensville that was going on. So that's the value of the construction. And I guess while I have the floor, if I may, Mayor, just a comment on the cost difference. As well, that $100,000. I just would like to draw attention to the sample size of the multiple units for this year. We're talking about 5 townhomes, I think it was, in the Park Lane development off Rebstock. That would be, the average price. Beyond that, I didn't have much more in the way of multiples, whereas last year there was far more. This quarter, last year, I believe there was a considerable amount of townhomes, and so those prices. That's why I think I put in there, it's not reflective of the affordability issue because it's such a small sample size. So that particular development and that block of townhomes, that was the market price. So, okay, just while I had the opportunity.
Your Worship. IS-42 2019, a constituent had reached out to us to ask how many trees were planted. And I wondered if the director would be able to answer that questions to that. I mean, we did respond to the constituent, but it would be good for everybody to hear that.
Mr. Walsh.
Yes, thank you. Town directly has planted in the last 3 years about 193 trees. We've also given away in the last 2 springs over 1,200 trees. We plan to continue with our tree giveaway until the demand is satisfied. Following the completion of the EAB cutting program, we will be focusing on a replanting program throughout town.
So on the heels of that, the same constituent wrote back and asked a very interesting question. And I wondered, in paraphrasing her words, is there an appetite for full replacement of the cut trees to be a priority between the years of 2020 and 2022?
So can you paraphrase that? Or restate the question?
Wants to know if all the trees that came down can be replaced tree for tree.
On a one-for-one basis, that's our goal. It doesn't always work out that way.
Thank you.
Any other councillors? Councillor Lubberts.
Yes, thank you very much, Mayor Redekop. PDS 67, the Development Services Report on, I guess it's page 26 of 27. The activities comments. There's a zoning charge that's still before the courts. And I'm just wondering, I know what property this is. This is the Favreau property. And I'm just wondering, how much money of tax dollars have we spent going after Mr. Favreau and his property? I mean, this has been going on since 2005. And now we're in court again. We've gone court 4 times with this family. We've lost all 4 times. We lost in the summer. Now we're going to appeal it. And I'd like to know, number one, does the legal department have a blank check that they can just spend money and not come to council for approval if it's over a certain amount?
Mr. Cookett?
Through your worship to the councillor, to answer your first question, I'm not sure how much we have spent to date, and it's something I could get for you. Do we have a blank check? No, we don't. Under the procurement policy, I do have authority to spend up to $50,000 without bringing it to council. I don't know how close to that number we are presently, but it's something I can provide to council if that's what you're asking.
Thank you very much. Mayor Redekop, through you. We don't know how much we've spent, and our CAO's office has $60,000 that they can spend before they come to council.
You just said 50,
50?
and
All right.
you've asked a question that it's hardly fair to suggest staff doesn't know. They don't know right now. They could.
That's fine. I'm okay with that.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I'm okay with that.
That's fine.
Yeah, no. But, so now, we need to know how much did it cost for this lawsuit that we just lost in August, right? And that same lawsuit, now you're going to spend more money. So if it's over 50,000, I would think that you need to come to council and get approval. And because now you're going to be over your $50,000 limit. And I mean, that's just the money that you're spending. To me, it's why are we constantly going after Mr. Favreau on this property? I have followed this. There's a subdivision going on in there, and for some reason, they want access to that subdivision from Garrison Road, which would go through Mr. Favreau's property. He offered to sell that property to the developer. The developer didn't buy it. Why is the town of Fort Erie pursuing this when the developer isn't?
I don't think it has anything to do with the development. As I understand it, it has to do with the property that Mr. Favreau is operating a storage facility, I believe. Is that correct, Mr. Cookett?
That is correct, Your Worship, and I would recommend that we refrain from too much discussion on this because we are in litigation right now.
So the matters before the court, Councillor Lubberts, there's very limited that staff can say with respect to this, and I would suggest that if you want to delve further into this, we'd have to go into closed session.
Well, we need to, Mayor Redekop, we need to know what it is that we're after here. I mean, we've been going after this guy since 2005. And what is the goal here? That's what we need to know. And if we need to go into closed session, then maybe staff should call us into closed session to discuss it so that we can get a clear understanding of exactly what it is we're up against here. Because this is taxpayers' money that we're spending on court cases that we're constantly losing.
Well, staff doesn't call us into closed session. If you want to move into closed session, you'd have to put that on the floor.
Yes, I'd like to go into closed session and discuss this because we need answers. This isn't our money. This is tax dollars.
Okay, so if, we're going to vote on that, and if you're successful and we go into closed session, I'm going to suggest we do it at the end of the meeting because we have some delegations here. So I'm going to call the question. Who wants to go into closed session to discuss this issue at the end of the agenda? Opposed? It's carried. Okay, so when we get to the end of the agenda, we'll talk about your issue on this particular matter, Councillor Lubberts. Any other questions of the items in the consent agenda? Then I'm going to call the question. All those in favor? None opposed. That is carried. That then takes us to Planning and Development Services, and is that Councillor Noyes? Councillor Noyes.
Thank you, Mayor Redekop. Planning and Development Services is now in session. Our first delegation is Paul, I can destroy people's names, Smetten, close, President and CEO of the Canadian Centre. Welcome.
And then, of course, suggest policy approaches to address those current and future needs for housing in Fort Erie. So currently, if we have a look at the graph at the top, this is tenure by household type. You can see that Fort Erie is composed predominantly of couples without children. Then you have single, what they call non-census families, which is dominated by single households. And thirdly, couples with children. You can also see the majority of couples without children own their own property. And then when it comes to singles, there is a high proportion of renters within that particular group. When we have a look at housing stock in Fort Erie, and I'll just note that the legend here is turned around, so the dark is owners and it's the same as the legend above. But as you can see here, Fort Erie is dominated by single detached dwellings. You can also see that that is majority owned by those property owners. And then when you have a look at apartments of 5 stories or less, they're predominantly rented. And apartments of over 5 stories is all rented in the town of Fort Erie. So it gives you a little bit of a snapshot of what the town of Fort Erie actually looks like currently. Currently, there's over 1,800 households in core housing need. So core housing need means that at least one condition of it's unaffordable, it's unsuitable, so there's not enough bedrooms, or it's inadequate. It needs a lot of repairs. So one of those need to occur, plus there is no alternate marking housing in the area that could provide for that household's income. So that's the definition of core housing need. Core housing need is typically a smaller group of people because of there's more rules in order to be able to satisfy that definition. If you were to look at unaffordability, it would be a larger cohort of people. But under core housing need, you'll see that single-person households are the majority of people in core housing need in Fort Erie. And you will find that a majority of those are either split between younger people or older people. Then you have lone parent households, which represents about 309 households in Fort Erie. Then we have a look at affordable housing units within Fort Erie. You can see that the number of affordable housing units in Fort Erie pales in significance to the actual population that is still out there, that is currently in core housing need. So that is a sort of a snapshot of what the Fort Erie currently looks like, and there's quite a comprehensive report that backs this up that I believe you'll be getting an updated copy of next week. And you'll see how these numbers have come together. Then what we've done is 3 development scenarios to look at, okay, between now and 2041, what might be the needs of Fort Erie under different policy assumptions. The first policy assumption is, let's say, the status quo, which you keep doing what you're doing in terms of dwelling formation rates, which is predominantly single detached homes. Then we have a slow growth rate that you actually go back to historical lower rates that have been seen historically. And then we'll have a look at the target growth rate. So the target growth rate is ultimately driven by a mandate from the province under places to grow. But it's also, there is a population growth. It's occurring. And so you have policy provincially and regionally meets statistics about populations, and that's ultimately what becomes the target growth rate. And in this table here, what we've got is the 3 scenarios out to 2041. So under the target growth rate, Fort Erie would require 5,200 extra homes, dwellings. And of that, a majority of them would be considered to be apartments. And what we're doing here is that we're looking at the fact that there is a build-up within the community, or a greater demand in the community for single dwellings, single household units, so 1-bedroom units. Then you have single detached, which is just under 2,000, row and semi-detached, which is 1,100, and I've mentioned apartments. Now, if you look at the status quo, there becomes a shortfall of 2,800 dwellings. Now, what happens in a shortfall is you'll find that the demand pressure exceeds supply, and you're going to exacerbate affordability problems. Under the shortfall, under slow growth, naturally that actually increases. So just for emphasis, 5,200 dwellings under the target growth rates, and this has been performed in a consistent fashion with the region of Niagara and all 12 municipalities in Niagara, and how the population is trying to move around within Niagara, and the population growth that's trying to come into the Niagara region and into the town of Fort Erie. This slide essentially shows from a core housing need what the consequences of not building the demanded type of housing means for the population as a whole under core housing need. There is only one scenario that keeps core housing need at about the 15% of the population level, and that is the target growth rate scenario. If you were to have slow growth, you would be reaching a population that's close to 1 in 4 households in core housing need, as opposed to the current 1 in 9, 1 in 7. If you had a slow growth, then that gets exacerbated further. But the point being is that to keep, if you know your constituents, you live street level within this area, you already get a sense of what core housing need feels like. If from a development point of view or a population growth point of view, if you weren't to follow the target growth scenario, that experience you have of core housing need will only increase. So keys to success, and this is where we start talking about possible ways to navigate a difficult landscape of housing affordability and population growth that's exhibited by all municipalities across Ontario. Potential approaches is regulatory approaches, and we can talk a little bit about in terms of permitting shared housing. The common theme under regulatory approaches is how can you increase the productivity of land? And Councillor Lubberts, I can answer your question about affordability and what it means in terms of apartments and things of that nature. To earlier conversation that was brought up by Reverend is this new residential developments to include affordable units, which is very common practice now across the province. Limit single detached housing types to less than 40%. The message there is not to limit single detached housing in terms of development, but to actually keep an eye on the apartments. Right, those badly needed apartments in excess of 2,000 by 2041. And we can talk about the significance of those apartments because everyone has this mental idea of an apartment and it's ugly and it's tall and everything else. But what you'll find is because of your ageing demographics, those single bedroom dwellings will become extremely important to help current residents actually stay within the community. Because if they can't afford a house with empty bedrooms and the challenges of actually maintaining that home, there may be no better place for them to be. And that's exactly what we're seeing across the entire GTHA, is people aging in homes, but with this development of empty bedrooms, which is reducing the productivity of what you've got. Once those houses were filled with families. And once Fort Erie had a certain character. And there are similar issues. If you'd like to go back to examples in Toronto, I'm happy to share those with you. Financial approaches. So financial approaches are property tax incentives, other incentives for affordable units, whether it's development charge waivers or a housing reserve fund. Financial approaches, though, and one thing I'd encourage you to ask questions about is, do financial approaches always mean that you have to pay or the residents have to pay? And the answer is no. And we can explore the concept of you create value as local government policies. You create value for landowners. And that is value created. Now, how could you capture some of that value and turn it into a public good? Whether it might mean creating more affordable units for, say, different zoning, for instance. And then, of course, there's partnership approaches between vacant dwellings and community groups and working with Niagara Region and provincial housing programs. And I can tell you with the work that has been done with Niagara Region and the work that's been done with the staff here at Fort Erie, there is a lot of conversation about how and novel ways of trying to squeeze productivity out of current housing stock, out of future housing stock, and what might be the best mix for the characterisation of neighbourhoods. So key takeaways currently, households with total income of under $40,000 are in core housing need predominantly. They're renter households, single person and lone parent households. These types of households require one bedroom bachelor or family friendly units and they don't need to be big. Affordable rental housing. Most households in core need cannot afford more than about $730. Just to give you an idea of where that threshold looks like in Fort Erie. Looking forward, Fort Erie could experience, under a status quo scenario, a shortfall of about 2,800 dwellings by the year 2041. which is a planning target year. I know it's an odd one. Lack of housing would put additional pressure on housing and prices and local rents. It's a very high probability that if there's a housing shortfall in Fort Erie, the prices will continue to go up. And what you might find is those big balance sheets and incomes that are retiring outside the GTA will be able to crowd out people that are within Fort Erie that can't actually relocate within Fort Erie. The rate of core housing need could increase. So hitting the target growth rate would require about 21% of new housing units to be semi or row houses and 41% to be apartment units. So I'll leave it there and I'd be happy to take your questions.
You're the chair, Councillor Noyes.
I'm sorry. I think we were still in public meetings. I'm sitting here. Oh, all these questions. Any comments or questions for the presenter, Councillor Butler?
Thank you, Madam Chair. That was a great presentation, and having the opportunity to sit on the committee, I've already read the report in full, so it was very fulsome. Just to comment and then ask you a couple of questions, I did want to comment that the committee itself found some really interesting points that we're going to be developing for the future. 2041 is only 21 years away, so it's a short distance, and land is finite, so to plan now is prudent for us, especially with the lack of land that's available in the Fort Erie marketplace. What I find particularly interesting is that you mentioned that there would be a swing of population coming from the GTA areas or bigger cities into the area to for retired people to move in and to have a better life, I guess, here with their financial situation. But I'm wondering if you could talk about the problem that we'll be experiencing if we don't start building the affordable units now and creating an atmosphere to attract younger individuals and families, young families, because I think that there's going to be an economic downturn in our community if we don't address the situation, and that means less employment and companies looking to go elsewhere because the employment pool isn't available in the area. So I'm hoping that you can speak to that.
Sure. Yes, Your Worship. It's, I'll give you an example in Toronto. Toronto has grown by 250,000 people since 2001. In 45% of Toronto, it's increased by population by 480,000 people. The other 55% actually shrunk by 250,000 people. So the development of Toronto, for instance, it's called the Yellow Belt, and the development of Toronto is hollowing out, right? Because you've got the, say, not in my backyards, and you've got people aging within place, and then you have the advent of Airbnb. It actually exacerbates the fact that people can hold on to their places longer because they can rent the bedrooms and things of that nature. So the problem with that is that your local businesses begin to suffer because older people tend to have a different spending profile than younger people. You find that you don't have the labour force and they have to travel quite significant distances, and therefore prices start to go up. And eventually you do get to the economic point where the number of people, what they call the dependency ratio, that the number of people who aren't in the labour force as a ratio of the people who are starts to become unsustainable. And so it will be difficult to actually draw employees into the region. And therefore you yourselves will have to travel to get services or in order to be able to enjoy the lifestyle that you like. Alternatively, there could be another scenario in which you just need bigger incomes and wealthier people here to be able to sustain and pay for the higher prices. When I mentioned the movement from Toronto, for instance, or the GTA into outer areas, what I'm referring to there is that push, right? You see it now. You see the property prices are going up. And part of the problem is that when you're looking to finance infrastructure and you need to pay your property taxes, and things are getting more expensive in the grocery store because you can't just get away with minimum wage anymore. Someone has to travel outside the region to work. Prices become higher. And I'm an older person living in the area. I've lived in the area for many years, and now I'd like to move. I'd like to tap into my balance sheet and get the equity out of my home and stay in the region. But there's nothing but single detached dwellings. Right? There's no cheaper alternatives for me to downsize, or what we like to call right size. And that's what I was getting at, is that you will also see part of that process, which we've seen in many countries, in which you're just basically swapping out the citizens that used to live here with citizens that actually can bring the money and actually pay for the goods and services in the region. So the point being is that I think, if I'm taking up your theme correctly, is there are risks. While we might see short-term rewards in trying to keep status quo, there's significant risks of not planning for the future, and the fact that populations are getting older, and therefore the challenges of having a diversified community are growing. That doesn't mean they can't be met. It just means that sometimes the way we used to plan 50 years ago is not the way we need to be planning today. And while this study is not about the execution of exactly what to build and where to build it, there are community neighbourhood planning techniques available to planners. I'm not a planner, so I won't get into details, but you can make a community architecturally relevant, character relevant, and still maintain or increase the productivity of the land that you have. Because land and infrastructure, it's also the productivity of infrastructure is that I'm not sure if the numbers have been run, but if you do move towards a status quo scenario for the next 20 years, will that population be able to sustain the cost of the infrastructure? Right, especially when you're looking at now at issues of climate change, which means you've got to have larger gauges on your sewage or wastewater pipes and things like that.
Councillor Butler?
Thank you. And Madam Chair, just a couple of more questions. You raised some interesting points. I was reading in an article with respect to the difference in the economies for our generation who worked long term, and the generation up and coming who are not going to be as fortunate and will be jumping from job to job to job for career placements. And in that article, it did raise some concerns with respect to the type of salary, annual salary ranges that our youth are facing at this point, where when we were growing up and we got married, our income was valued at 3 times the amount for a household affordable home. So, if we were making $50,000 jointly, we could afford $150,000. Currently, if we're looking at the rates that are in the marketplace right now for the least expensive home, and let's say it's $349,000, a person making $30,000 would never be able to afford that because it's 12 times
Correct.
the affordability level.
Yeah.
And even at $75,000, it's still 5 times the affordability level. If that's not an argument to be able to build affordable housing within our marketplace, and to correct the thinking, not in my backyard, that yes, it should be in your backyard, it should be in everybody's backyard because we need it. Would you say that an education program to start educating our citizens to the fact would be appropriate to start changing that mindset?
I would. It's outside the scope of this particular study, but it's not outside the scope of studies we've done before. And I think that people need to be educated as to the choices they're making. Because if you say no to one thing, you're saying yes to something else. And our comfort zone as human beings is if we say no to something and we don't know what we're saying yes to, it's easy to say no. And then it becomes a question of community values and a question of people's preferences for the community and the character of the community they live in. And that's really not much more that can be said. We live in an age where we do have the statistics and the data to tell us under different policy scenarios what's the risk and what's the reward. And part of this is the reward is diversified community. Part of the reward here is you can keep prices low in the region because wages aren't going to go through the roof because you have to start importing workers potentially. For instance, and I'll give you, so the answer is yes. And very quickly, you're right about the economic development aspect. I'll give you another example is when we did the region of Niagara and all 12 municipalities, we found that if the region of Niagara didn't support the municipalities in the target growth, that you could be missing about 25,000 employees alone in accommodation and tourism that the region needs to actually meet its economic criteria. So housing goes hand in hand with economic development. Housing's fundamental. It's as fundamental as a road or a pipe in terms of the character and the future development of the region.
Councillor Butler? Councillor Dubanow.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, and through you to the presenter. Thank you very much. This was very enlightening. I actually had a smile on my face and was nodding on many of the points that you were bringing up because it's very refreshing to hear this. Now, you just to go into some of the figures you had mentioned that under all growth scenarios, regardless of whether it's the status quo, the slow growth, or except the other option, that we'd have a shortfall of 2,150 apartment units under all three growth scenarios. Now, you heard what had been mentioned here before about, there's some resistance to that kind of growth. Now, with demand outpacing supply, which you had mentioned earlier, that's going to have a direct impact on the affordability of all housing within our community, if I'm understanding what you said. Is that correct?
Yeah, the target growth actually meets the growth. So if you were to build according to target growth, you'd actually meet the demand. Both statistically, it just happens to be a coincidence this time, but places to grow and statistics actually coincidentally match each other. So if you were to build 5,200 dwellings, as it is on slide 5, you'd actually meet statistically what demand is expected to be. If you were to just keep doing what you're doing, you would have a shortfall of about 2,800 dwellings within the region. So that would put upward pressure on the value or the market price of dwellings. The other point I made is that under all scenarios tested, so there are more scenarios that we've run other than the ones we're sharing with you. Unfortunately, you cannot reduce core housing need in Fort Erie or in the region of Niagara. And there are some fundamental reasons for that. It's twofold. There's financial inequality and there's income inequalities that are underwriting this foundational core need within communities. And coming back to Councillor Butler's earlier remarks of when she was growing up And having a family, the experience was different to what it was for people today going through that process. So I hope I've cleared up. If you keep doing what you're doing, there will be a shortfall of at least about half of what you need. And secondly, even if you were to keep up with demand, you could not reduce core housing need percentage of the population. But at least it won't grow on you by 30%.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I'm glad you touched on that. And just I'm glad you mentioned the 2 points about the changing, particularly people my age, the struggles with, as Councillor Butler had mentioned about, the job market. We don't have careers that last an entire life. We typically have a span where we move back and forth. And you also touched on income inequality, which is a very, very important issue as well, which, certainly we're paying attention to. Now, there was another point I wanted to bring up too with regard to how we grow, and you kind of touched on it a little when you mentioned climate change. Is it within your purview of the report and the information you put together to touch on the environmental impacts on the type of housing? Or just okay? You kind of touched on it, and that's why it was.
Right. My point there is that the cost of maintaining communities is naturally getting more expensive. And climate change is a factor of that because of engineering standards are changing. And so getting productivity out of that infrastructure dollar is becoming even more important. And that just happens to be if you've got one house at the end of the pipe, it can be different if you have 10 houses at the end of the pipe. The cost base of that pipe is actually spread.
No, and I definitely appreciate that. It's something that's important to me with regard to urban sprawl and transit accessibility. And I was wondering if that was something that you'd be able to speak to further. But I appreciate where you're coming from, and I think you touched on it enough tonight. So I do appreciate that.
Thank you.
Any further comment? Mayor Redekop?
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. And this is both interesting, inspiring in some respects in terms of glimpsing the opportunities that we have before us, but periodically discouraging because you've mentioned that even hitting target growth, we're not going to change the housing core need. And the reality is, right now, we're building about 200 units per year.
Mm-hmm.
So over the next 21 years, that gets us to 4,400. We're still under. We're terribly reliant upon builders wanting to build here. And we're about to, I believe, if council is on board, we're about to tell builders, we would prefer that you build something other than what you want to build. And how, in your experience, what's the nice way to tell them that?
Mr. Smeaton?
Wow, it's a very good question, Your Worship. Okay, so in my experience, builders, developers are like any other business. They're very easy to understand, right? They want to make a margin on what they do. They want to build it, and then they want to get out of there and get on to the next building. It's like any business. Like any business, they don't like change. So we do quite a lot of work for CMHC, and there is a systemic difference between what happens in Montreal, for instance, and what happens in the Greater Toronto Area and Niagara. And it's because builders, their business models are set up differently, and that's it. So builders don't like to start to change what they're doing, is the key message. But builders, because they're in business and they're fairly easy to understand, you've got to then look at, well, the rate of return is divided by another number, which is called risk. So it becomes a risk-adjusted rate of return. And in our experience, if you have a builder and you say to the builder, there's 20 steps for you to get through and in 7 years in order to be able to go from you owning the land to being able to build something on it, then the risk of that is much longer. If you were to say to a builder, we could do this in 3 years, there are concessions and things that builders will actually, because you're now working within their business model of starting to make the path towards getting something done quicker, less red tape and things of that nature. And so you're de-risking their process, which is worth money to them. That's the first point. The second point is, I guess what I'm getting at is that you can create value for builders or developers, one way or another, through zoning and what have you, that will meet their criteria of actually for them to be able to change what they're building. The other thing is that being able to attract developers and builders from outside the region that can build what you're hoping for. And if there is an economic recession, which we're expecting at the end of next year and into 2021, there may be the opportunity that when builders don't have as much work as they like, you might be able to attract builders from other locations to build what's possible. But essentially, change is difficult, it seems, for many constituents within the community, and for builders that's going to be a challenge as well.
If I might
Mayor
ask
Redekop?
one more question that is on the caution side. Even if we meet the targets, even if we build the 5,200 units, even if 2,150 of them are apartment units, there are factors that control movement of people that are going to make it, I think, difficult for us to still manage to keep our core housing need numbers down, such as what's been happening for the last decade, where we have people moving in from the GTA who have the money to pay for homes that have the high-end finishes and the big houses, which increase not only the housing market for the new houses, but it tends to increase the prices of the existing stock. So, short of telling builders you've got to change from single-family dwellings to apartments or townhouses, you've got to cut down on the high-end aspect of your construction and start making non-luxurious units. And even at that, even if we did that, sorry that I'm answering my own question, but even if we did that, that still attracts people who would be looking for that type of housing, not just in Fort Erie, but in other parts of Niagara and perhaps beyond. So is there a silver lining to the dark cloud that I see hovering over this initiative, which is terribly important for our community, particularly for the sustainability of the people that live here and for the health of the community? Is there a silver lining?
Mr. Smeaton?
Yeah, so it's 2,150 apartments. I think that there is a balance. And again, this is not about execution. This is about, bringing the news of what it will be in demand and what would be appropriate as the people within the community try and shift from large dwellings to right sizing and things of that nature. So when you say that you're asking builders to build cheaper and less fancy stuff, that's one conversation of many, because I suspect that you'll have the balance. I suspect that you'll be looking for that balance within the characteristics of your communities and things of that nature. The silver lining is that if you don't do certain things, then worse will happen. The silver lining is that you're actually in a good position relative to other places in Ontario that have made bigger mistakes. Whether they've got, like, for instance, you look at the city of Toronto is trying to grow on a footprint that it was never intended, or it's hollowing out. You have the opportunity for some of this foresight. and to sort of see if you can take some of the forces at work and the demand pressures at work, and how do you mould that into, you know, the community and character of Fort Erie in the modern century. And so I think that that's part of the silver lining. Other than that, we are living in the age of there's so much money around, and yet it's sitting on private balance sheets, and it's not being put to work for public good. And we are living in the world of scarce resources for the majority, and excess resources for the few. And that just happens to be part of the puzzle and the challenges of the modern age.
Thank you very much. I just want to commend you for the work that you've done and the assistance you've given the Affordable Housing Committee.
Thank you.
Councillor Lubberts.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for coming forward. I'm trying to wrap my head around how we're going to make this work. What I'm reading here is the lack of housing puts pressure on prices, and it puts pressure on rent.
Mm-hmm.
And that pressure makes those things rise. So somehow I have to convince everybody in this town that I'm going to do whatever I can to lower the value of your home, and I'm not going to allow you to collect $1,200 a month rent. You're only going to get $737.
Yeah.
That's a tough sell to tell somebody I'm taking away from you. I don't know how we're going to go about doing that other than having some sort of incentive for them that they would still meet their targets. But my question is, have you experienced any municipalities that have been successful at doing what this report's telling us that we need to do?
Mr. Smeaton?
Yes, Your Worship, it's yes and no. It's again, it's a balance between what is the community you want to live in. I'll tell you my own story. I live in downtown Toronto. I live in a 5-story old building. It's 200 years old. It's near Moss Park. It's Sherbourne and Adelaide East. And you know, we push back against, personally as a resident, push back against developers and things like that, and very active in the city's planning. Because part of the thing is that when I go to work, I don't want to be stepping over a homeless person. When there are people in core housing need around me, or people with less, and just because a resident such as myself might have more, it doesn't make for a quality of life or the character of the area. You know, one of the things we're fighting for is to keep the character of the street level and the heritage in Toronto, because we really are getting hit hard from a massive development wave. So you're right. When is enough enough? I don't know. It's a really hard sell. Part of that sell, though, is education, just at least informing people of what the consequences of no means, right? What does that, if you say no to something, what does yes mean somewhere else? And if you're saying yes to something, then what are the consequences of the unintended consequences? You're saying no to something else. And so it's very difficult as human beings for us to think in long term. That's why many of us, me, smoked when I was a kid. I was immortal, right? Now I'm 51, I don't smoke. But long-term planning is something there's always a challenge to us. But maybe through education we can give them a sense of they're members of the community and the character of Fort Erie. What do you want this region to be in the 2040s? And, you know, ultimately it is, you know, do you want just a lot of rich people who are bringing in workers to serve, Or do you want a diversified community? Do you want to see children within the communities, things of that nature? So I don't know, Councillor. It's very difficult, hard sell, but it really comes back to the question of what are your values? Not just for yourself and for your balance sheet, but for your community and things of that nature.
Councillor Lubberts?
Thank you very much. I agree and see that I can only say on my own experience, this council brought this forward, and that sounds to me like this council is committed to something like this. But the problem that we're going to run into is the next council going to follow through. There's where the problem lies, and this is difficult. I'm trying to wrap my head around. I know lots of people that build homes, and I don't know too many of them that want to build an apartment building. And this is, it's interesting. It has to be done. Somehow we'll have to work around it, and we'll see how we make out, but this is a tough sell. Thanks.
Any further comments or questions? Seeing none, thank you. Mr. Smeaton, for your presentation.
Just one last comment on the councillor's last final statement is housing and economic development, you can think of them as joint. So what's one of the biggest industries of the future is young people looking after older people. Right, so think in terms of, well, what's the symbiotic connection between the ageing of the community and the residents and having that vibrancy? So housing for younger people that are ultimately in services for residents. So that's just something to take into consideration, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. That brings us to our next presentation. Jill? Jill Hike?
It's pronounced Julke.
Julke?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah,
You have it over here. Good evening, Your Worship and members of council. In May of this year, Paradigm was retained by the town to conduct the the Crystal Beach parking study. And the purpose of the study was to assess the current and future parking needs of Crystal Beach neighborhood and to develop a plan to ensure an adequate supply of parking is available to the neighborhood through 2041 and beyond. And this study directly relates to the town's secondary plan for the Crystal Beach neighborhood with future requirements based on growth estimates contained within the plan. So what we did, we determined the current supply of parking that exists within the town today, within the neighborhood today. We captured parking demand during peak summer season. We estimated the future parking required to support the growth that's been put forward within the secondary plan. We estimated the parking surplus through the 2041 horizon, and we provided recommendations and guidance on the development of municipal parking strategy to ensure an adequate supply of parking through 2041. What we did not do is we did not identify where future parking should be provided, and a little bit more explanation will come forward as I go through my presentation on this. We did not identify where accessible parking should be provided and at what rates, and again, I will touch on this a little bit further in my presentation. We did not assess the paid parking program within the Bay Beach area because that was undertaken by Infrastructure Services and will be addressed by them, to my understanding. And we did not address any of the existing perceived shortfall in parking that exists today because the purpose of this was to determine an adequate strategy through 2041. Our study area was subdivided into 3 sections. We had Area A, which is the Bay Beach area. This area is generally bounded by Rosewood Avenue on the west, Oakwood Avenue and Maplewood Avenue on the east, Glen Spring Avenue on the north, and Erie Road to the south, and this area also included the Hill Cottagers Association lot that's located south of Erie Road. Area B is the commercial core, which is generally bounded by Oakwood Avenue and Maplewood on the west,
Widgeway Road on the east, Conway Road to the north, and Erie Road to the south. The remainder of the study area was the Crystal Beach neighborhood itself, and the main focuses were on the waterfront, boat launch and parking area, and the arena, community center, and library, as they're recognized as places where there's larger supplies of parking currently available. So prior to conducting our survey, we went out and collected the existing supply of parking that is within the neighborhood. This was an inventory of all on-street parking, public parking lots, and private lots. Our estimated parking supply is 1,534 spaces. And I use the word estimate simply because most of the spaces within the neighborhood are not striped, meaning there's not a defined parking space for a vehicle. Most of it is just permitted parking on specific sides of the road. And the supply is dependent upon how vehicles are parked and the size of the vehicles themselves. For instance, there may be space for 2 vehicles in front of a house, but if somebody pulls up and parks in the middle of them, it reduces the effective supply to 1 space. The supply did also not include areas where parking is not permitted, such as in no parking areas, across driveways, and at fire hydrants, and also within areas that are already marked no parking permitted. The bulk of the parking itself is provided within Area A, the beach area, where we have 806 parking spaces, with Area B and Area C equally having about 350 average parking spaces. We collected data on 3 peak summer season days that was decided in conjunction with Mr. Chris Miller from the Planning Department. We collected data on Sunday, June 30th, Monday, July 1st, and Saturday, July 13th. These dates were strategically selected to be able to capture the Canada Day weekend traffic that might slightly spill over into Independence Day, and then Saturday, July 13th, which is another Saturday during peak season. As you can see from here, we had perfect beach weather during all of the days where we collected data. And this photo that is shown here was collected by drone on Sunday, June 30th. And a rough estimate that the beach was at about 80-ish% occupancy, give or take a few people. So the overall parking demand occurred on Sunday, June 30th. The peak parking demand occurred on the Sunday, June 30th, when the maximum demand was 900 vehicles, or about 59% of the supply of 1,534 spaces. This peak demand occurred at about 3 p.m. in the afternoon. On Monday, July 1st, the peak demand occurred around 2 o'clock in the afternoon and was 737 spaces, or about 48% of the estimated supply. Saturday, July 13th, the maximum number of cars parked was observed at 516, or about 34% of the supply. Overall, the peak parking demand occurred between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. on each of the respective survey days. So it's pretty consistent in when we were seeing this occur. We also collected parking duration data over the course of the survey, and this was collected by recording the last 3 license plate numbers or digits parked in a marked parking space, which those are located predominantly within Area A and Area B. The duration data included here indicates that approximately 70% of all the vehicles were parked for 3 hours or less. This means that we're not seeing instances of long duration parking outside of the beach area in marked spaces. This duration data does not apply to the unmarked on-street spaces that comprise the bulk of the parking located within the neighborhood. So the future parking requirements were determined based on the secondary plan rate of residential and commercial development that is expected to occur within the neighborhood between now and 2041. And I stress that these are the maximum densities that are forecast, and as they work their way through site plan for each respective one, it is likely the densities will be reduced and therefore the parking requirements themselves will be reduced. As you can see here, the residential in Area A is required to be provided at 1 space per dwelling unit, which is the Erie Tourist Commercial Area. And then within the Erie Derby mixed use and Area C, which is the remainder of the study area, residential parking is required to be provided at a rate of 1.25 spaces per dwelling unit as per the current bylaw. These spaces are required to be provided on-site for each of the development applications. On-site commercial parking is not required for areas A and B under the current bylaw that's in force within the neighborhood. So based on the development forecast, a total of 1,343 parking spaces will be required to support the future growth that's planned to occur by 2041. It is estimated that a total of 1,411 of those parking spaces could be accommodated within the existing sites themselves based on rough measurements of what will be available after the percentage of coverage by the buildings is taken into account. So overall, the on-site parking supply that is estimated to be provided on those lots results in a surplus of 68 spaces when compared to what is going to be required to accommodate the bylaw parking supply. Based on the existing parking surplus in each area and when adjusted to account for the divesting of the lot on Erie Road, northeast of the beach, there is estimated to be a future surplus of 573 spaces within the town. As you'll note here, the future off-site development parking requirement is 0 because on the previous slide, we identified that there's going to be a roughly a surplus of about 68 spaces of on-site parking after the developments have gone forward and the parking is provided on-site. So what this 573 spaces means are these are the spaces that can be used by commercial development that's going to go in the area, because right now, commercial development will not be required to provide parking. This can also be used by visitors to the area and to accommodate any other special event parking or things like that that might happen over the course of the next 21 years. As well, that surplus will allow for quite a good a good supply of accessible parking spaces, because right now this is based on standard parking provisions and the number of spaces and the typical size of a space. So at 573, if you are required to provide larger parking spaces, and you'll be reducing that surplus by a greater ratio. However, with a surplus of 573, there's a lot of flexibility. And I will also highly stress, this is based on the peak parking demand. This does not apply to the off-peak seasons of the fall, winter, and spring where there's an ample supply of parking. And as well as the development applications themselves are put forward, it is very likely that the actual densities and unit counts will be reduced as each of those go to site plan. We had a community engagement component. We posted notices on the town's communication channels, including the website, social media, community boards, and newspapers. An open house with the parking study was held in conjunction with the town's secondary plan public information open house, where about 180 persons attended. We had online surveys for both the public and the business improvement area. And we received about 70 total responses to the surveys that were put out to the public. And we had 2 BIA meetings, an informal BIA meeting in advance of the open house. And there they requested us to present ourselves formally as a designation, and I attended that meeting in September. We developed recommendations based on the finding of our study, and we divided them into 3 bins. We had short-term, medium-term, and long-term recommendations. Our short-term recommendations were heavily focused on the now, meaning in the next 5 years, which is the maintenance and improvements of the parking lots, providing on-street signage to direct people to both public parking areas for the commercial core and the beach, and just to bring awareness that parking does exist, because we found in some cases the signs themselves were a little bit less than stellar. Within the commercial core, we recommended parking time limits of about 2 hours, because this reflects the duration data that was captured, and it also takes into consideration the conversations that was had with the BIA in September. They recognize that this is a really good jumping off point for them, that put the 2-hour limit in place, then it can be monitored and adjusted as needed to make sure that their patrons have parking when they require it. we suggested that additional information is provided online on the town's website that directs people to parking areas, the cost of parking, and specifically letting them know that the paid parking, we found it heavily focused right north of the beach and that it is extended out to the streets east and west of it, and again, in conjunction with the signage to spread those parking demand across those streets and having parking closer to the beach. And we recommend considering bundling a bus pass in with a beach pass, which would encourage people to take transit and also opens up the option to potentially use the arena parking area as an overflow parking if there's any events that are going on within the community. The medium-term recommendation was to formalize the agreement with the Hill Cottagers organization for the parking in perpetuity south of Erie Road. This lot is currently being used for Summer Beach overflow parking, and they're seeing a pretty good turnover in the lot, and it is also pretty much at capacity the 3 days that we were out there. And we're also recommending to maintain the parkland character of that parking lot. And in the long term, we're recommending that parking for growth is provided within the commercial core, and where on-site parking is not provided, arrangements can be made with the town, such as cash in lieu or private parking off-site if somebody else has a surplus of parking on their land. We recommend to retain the existing municipal lots and on-street parking spaces in the commercial core and refrain from the removal of parking specifically within the commercial core, because that is one of the things the BIA strongly was opposed to, any removal of parking from their patrons. And we also recommend to protect existing town-owned land in the commercial core for the provision of parking to 2041 and beyond. And presently, there is no demand for any additional parking within the town. Therefore, we have not recommended where any additional parking should be located. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Any comments or questions? Councillor Lubberts.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair. Can we just go back to slide 11?
Yes.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, I'm looking at the numbers. Second, third columns add up. And why would the first one not? 170.
Okay.
Or the second one, why does the second one not add up? I'm sorry.
Because I'm really bad at math.
2 and 311, huh?
Because I'm bad at math.
Oh, there is a mistake.
There is a mistake in the table,
right,
yes.
Okay. All right. And slide 12, I think I had a comment on slide 12. No? The next slide. Okay, where did you mention bundling your bus pass and your beach pass?
Oh,
Was
that was
on
in this,
slide?
the transit bullet on this slide.
Yeah, transit, okay, all right. Can you just explain a little bit how you thought we might be able to do that?
Well, it would take a few departments to accomplish this. We have to have a discussion with transit and then with the department that issues the beach passes. And it would be some sort of a combined pass where I don't know what the current cost of a ride or beach pass is now.
Yeah.
But for maybe an additional $1 or $2 or some kind of an offset, or even the price of one trip, they could have all-day usage on the transit system, or it can be accomplished in multiple ways, and it would be something that would have to be explored further amongst the respective departments to find the right mix of attractiveness on price in order to get people to actually use the system. And even if it's a trial, you could do it for one summer and see how it works, and see what the transit ridership increase would result from that bundling.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Any further comments or questions? Mayor Redekop.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. The only real question I had was the parking spaces at the Crystal Ridge Arena and Library, which is kind of at the periphery of this area. And when we think of parking problems in Crystal Beach, we don't typically think of that particular area. So how many spots were allocated to that particular lot, or those two lots, if you recall?
Yes, just one moment, please.
was around 200.
Actually, I might be able to do it faster this way. So in Area C, we had 304 public parking spaces, so that would be a combination of what's at the arena, the waterfront lot, and the on-street, I believe it's Terrace Lane, that's just north of the waterfront lot, and the adjacent small parking lot by the Palmwood Hotel.
Right, so I'm thinking, just off the top of my head, I'm thinking that the waterfront park was around 68, 10 at the Palmwood, a few in front of Terrace Lane. So probably close to a couple hundred at the Crystal Ridge Library.
I think about 240 I believe is approximately where we were.
So although I would agree that it's part of this Crystal Beach area, the reality is that it's not likely, unless people carpool or take the transit, it's not going to really help the beach area. But that's really a defined and confined portion of the year, isn't it? We're talking June, July, August.
Yes, it is specific to that. And part of the reason why we also conducted the survey there and at the waterfront lot is because if we found that there was going to be a shortfall of parking within the commercial core in the beach area, we wanted to see what the surplus might be at some of the other parking areas within town, and then it could be put part and parcel of here as a carpool space, and then it works with the beach pass and bundling the transit, where if you have transit service going by the arena, then you could put this all together as a package and direct people that this is overflow parking for the busiest days that you see in the year. So that's the reasoning and the rationale behind collecting the data there to determine what the surplus was if it was required. One of the things of note as well with regards to the waterfront lot is we noticed that the demand far exceeded the supply because there were only a said number of marked parking spaces for boats and trailers, but we found that supply was well over 100% because passenger vehicles were just squeezing in anywhere that they could possibly park. So we have identified that as one of the measures in the maintenance of the lots right now, is to go out there and assess that and potentially restripe it and reconfigure the lot itself to accommodate the parking demand that we observed.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Any further comments or questions? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
Ms.
Thank you.
We're going to brings us to report number, no, I'm not doing this one. That brings us to report number PDS 64, 2019, Crystal Beach 2019 Parking Study Information Report. Report's now on the floor. Any comments or questions? Seeing none, all those in favor of the report? The report carries. That brings us to number PDS 65, 2019, Proposed Draft Plan Subdivision Combined Official Planning and Zoning Bylaw Amendment, Ashton Homes, Parkland Homes Builders, and Delta Bingo Incorporated. The report's now on the floor. Any comments or questions? Councillor Lubberts.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm just wondering if now, after we spoke with the gentleman about our housing, are we going to tell these people that they have to build an apartment building for us?
Councillor Lubberts, I will push that to one of the directors. Who'd like to take it?
Love to.
Yeah, good luck.
Love to. One of the issues that was raised at the public meeting that talked to development was the concept of whether or not there had been a neighborhood plan for this site. And if you look on page 10 of 18, you'll see that there's a paragraph which will be expanded in the final report, but definitely this area has had a secondary plan prepared for it back in 2007. And it's through the secondary planning process that we're identifying very much where intensification should occur. So we identify pockets for semis and towns and also apartments. So this particular area was looked at, and it was looked at within that context, and it was identified as being an area for the type of development that we have today, which is the townhouses and the single-family homes. So the answer to Councillor Lubberts' question is no, we're not going to be asking this gentleman for apartments, but we might be asking the region why they don't think apartments should be done on their site.
Thank you, Mr. Brady.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Brady mentioned the secondary plan. And now there was a gentleman up here earlier talking about secondary plans and neighborhood plans. And maybe we need a little better explanation. I'm with always the understanding that a neighborhood plan came first, then the secondary plan. And do we have a neighborhood plan and a secondary plan on this, in this area?
Mr. Brady?
To be very honest on that topic, the official plan that we have is a bit confusing on that overall thing. When the official plan was brought into place, we didn't have the robust secondary planning process that we have today. The neighborhood plans were plans that were done more on a technical basis, and they didn't really have a public process associated with them. And they certainly weren't brought into the official plan through an official plan amendment. So today, as I think you're all aware, we have a very robust secondary planning process. And our secondary planning process does all the work that a neighborhood plan would do, plus it has a very robust public consultation process. Many of you have been through the secondary plans with us, and you've seen the results of the amount of work that Mr. Miller in particular puts into place to get the information from the secondary plans. So our secondary planning process is the process. That's the process that we follow. It wouldn't be followed up with a neighborhood plan, and it certainly incorporates all of the elements of a neighborhood plan. If there's one thing I'm going to ask my staff to look at, is cleaning up the language in our official plan so that we understand that the process that we're dealing with is secondary planning and only secondary planning.
Councillor Lubberts.
So what I'm hearing then is the secondary plan that we're talking about is not the secondary plan that we're going through, the same secondary plan that we went through with Bridgeburg and we're going through right now with Crystal Beach. And we got a secondary plan with Ridgeway. It's a completely different animal, but it's got the same name.
Mr. Brady?
Back in the early 2000s, the idea, in 2007, a plan was proposed, approved by council in 2007 for this particular area. It was, it could be described as being both a secondary plan and a neighborhood plan. So that work was done, and if you will, if you look in the tables that are at the back, the appendix 6 to the report, which is page 24 of 40, you'll see that within that page, it identifies what came out of that particular concept of neighborhood design for the Garrison Greens area. So it identifies areas for the park, which is also described today, and also areas for single family, which is the yellow, and then medium density, which is the orange. If there had been some high rises, there would have been identified as such, but there wasn't in this particular area.
Councillor Lubberts?
So this secondary plan is the same as a secondary plan that we're going to have in Crystal Beach? That's what I'm trying to break apart.
Yes.
It's the same secondary plan, same concept.
I
Okay.
think Mr. Brady's saying yes.
The process is the same. Each secondary plan is slightly different from one another, the result of the discussions with the neighborhoods, but nonetheless, the process is the same.
Councillor Lubberts, anything further?
Yeah, I'm just curious as to why would it be that, from one of my understanding is if we have a secondary plan, we can make changes to it, and same as any other plan that we have. This is a proposed draft plan of subdivision, a proposed. So this is what they're proposing to do. Why is it that we can't start implementing some type of affordable housing and apartments and stuff on proposed plans of subdivision? Well, why are we bound to something that is only a proposal?
Mr. Brady?
Council can direct us to deal with affordable housing in any of the subdivisions, absolutely. But it doesn't mean that you have to put in an apartment building to create affordable housing. Perhaps a portion of the townhouses should be affordable housing in this particular context. And we're looking for, and I'm sure we'll be receiving, direction from our affordable housing group in the near future as to how to address that. The needs study, and I know I'm verging a bit, but if you just give me a second, the needs study talks about the fact that we need not only some more apartments, but we need some more townhouses, and that we need specifically units that would address the idea of having one bedroom or minimal number of bedrooms, not the 3 and the 4 and the 5 bedrooms that we get associated with single family housing. So it's within that context that we need to look for affordable housing. And as I've mentioned to the mayor before, and I know he agrees with me, smaller houses as well. And that's something that we can address, and we can address it through this draft plan if you wish to. We need that direction from you.
Yes, thank you very much. If I can remember at the gentleman's slide, he said that in order for us to meet our targets, that they recommended that any new development, that we would have 21% of any new development would be row housing or townhouses, and 40% be apartments, right? I'm pretty sure that's what the slide said. So
I think the overall goal was that, yes.
why is it that, I just want to know, why would we not do that in a subdivision, or do you want your apartment buildings outside the subdivision? And then, like the lady said, have your apartment buildings in one section of town. Don't just put it in the middle of residential areas. But I'm not grasping why. It's why Mr. Brady claims that we're not going to do that.
I don't think that's what Mr. Brady was saying, but again, I think what you're looking for is a comprehensive plan as we move forward. And is your question basically, can we start using some of those principles or suggestions on this particular plan of subdivision?
Yeah. So does this one meet 21% at least for row housing?
Well, I think at this point, there was no indication there'd be any affordable housing, but I'll give that to Mr. Brady. It was not a requirement.
There's no requirement for it within this plan subdivision at the present time. Certainly, if council wishes to direct us to look at that as an element as we move forward, I would caution that adding apartments in this one doesn't make as much sense as it does in others. We've had developments in front of council, draft plans in front of council, which have included apartments in the past. Harbor Town's the best example I can think of. An apartment in my opinion, a very appropriate location. We've also had the others approved, the one that's on the old golf course, apartments associated with that. So we do use the draft plan process for putting in apartments as we think are required and necessary. And we do think that as we move forward, there will be more apartments in subdivisions being proposed as we move forward, very much so.
Councillor Lubberts?
Okay, I'll look forward to seeing those.
Mayor Redekop?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that we don't yet have the policy document that would indicate that we can compel some of these changes. That's what we're going to get, and if we had been able to deal with the housing needs study report tonight, we'd be one step further. But what we do have in this particular area is a secondary plan that identifies this particular area as low-density residential. North of it on Garrison Road, there is medium to high-density residential proposed, so that in the long term, there could very well be apartments in this vicinity, not necessarily in this particular plan of subdivision. And I'm guessing, but I'd like a confirmation that the reason we would be taking money in lieu of parkland is because there is a proposed park, perhaps in the long term at least, identified in the secondary plan.
Mr. Brady?
Yes, I'll confirm that that is in fact the case. We're taking money from parkland in lieu to be able to provide the funding to be able to buy a park of a reasonable size rather than just a small size in one of the areas. And that we deal with parks in two ways in terms of where they should be and how big they should be. We both deal with it through the secondary planning process, which was dealt with here, but we also have another process which is called the master planning process for parks and other open space activities. We're in the process of updating that at the present time. So this particular green area that was been identified here was both identified through a master planning process, which was open and public in the past, and also through a secondary planning process.
Thank you, Mr. Brady. Mayor Redekop?
No, that's fine, thank you.
Any further comments or questions? I have one, if no one else is. Mr. Brady, the gentleman that was here, Mr. Wiseman, he had some questions and he was wondering if they were going to be addressed, particularly about and I think what Councillor Lubberts was pertaining to, the neighborhood plan and the official plan, and you know, we haven't quite followed the rules.
I've had discussions with Mr. Wiseman before, and he thinks we're not following the rules. We are following the rules. I've had discussions with him, both like man on man, if you will. We've also had discussions in terms of at the intermunicipal board, where he's made this position before, and they also agree with us that we're following the rules. So there's a paragraph in the information report that's before you. I'm going to suggest to Daryl that when the report comes forward as a full report, that there'll be a little more detail on that, so that we'll address the issue. But I don't think that that we're not following the rules.
Thank you, Mr. Brady. Questions? All those in favor of the report? The report carries. That brings us to report number PDS 66, 2019, proposed combined official plan and zoning bylaw amendment 745 Crescent Road, former water tower site, regional municipality of Niagara. It's now on the floor for comments and questions. Councillor Dubanow.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And through you, perhaps this is something Mr. Brady can address. I was just quickly looking at the Fort Erie Transit route maps, and this property here is located on Crescent Road, and it looks like this property is served by both the blue and the new green route, and it's located close to two bus stops. And I'm just wondering, based on the presentation that we had here about our core housing need and some of the other factors involved, I'm wondering if Mr. Brady perhaps could address whether this might actually be a suitable location for some kind of low-rise apartment that might be, you know, similar character to the neighborhood, what you'd find in a residential area.
Mr. Brady?
If you look at the map of the site, you'll see that it's not a particularly large block of land. What we're proposing on the site is a range of activities, single family through to some quads, and et cetera. It might be a site for a small apartment building. Probably wouldn't be a large apartment building, but it would be quite small. If you want to address the issue of ensuring that this site is used for more density, then you might want to direct staff to remove the single-family development as a possibility from the site. Because once the zoning is on the site, my understanding is the region's going to sell it, and then the developer that buys it would be bound to not be able to build single-family homes until they came back in front of council, if they decided to. So perhaps it's a site that the council may want to say, well, that's interesting. You have a range of options that's been laid out there, but perhaps a better range of options, which would be more socially palatable based on affordable housing issues and based on other types of issues, is to say, you know, this is a site that should be townhouses, quads, and apartments, or something to that effect. I wouldn't be opposed to that. This would not be a 10-story apartment building. This would be what we would refer to in the old days as the possibility of a walk-up.
Councillor Dubanow?
No, that answers my question, and I appreciate what Mr. Brady had to say. Thank you.
Councillor Zanko?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to make a comment. I do support this report, and it's also interesting because Mr. Smetanen, who was presenting the economic analysis, had mentioned that saying no to one thing says yes to another. And I don't know if some residents that were speaking here tonight are aware that the current zoning did actually allow a cell tower to go on that site originally. And we worked really hard with staff to make sure that didn't happen. So I'm very much in support of the change in zoning here. And again, just wanted to point out that by saying no to something like that could lead to something that I know residents would not be happy with. Thank you.
Any further comments or questions from anyone? The report, all those in favor? Okay, the report carries. That brings us to report number PDS 68, 2019, award of consulting contract for a community benefit charge strategy. The report's now on the floor. Thank you, Councillor McDermott. Any comments or questions? Seeing none, all those in favor? Report carries. That brings us to new business inquiries. And a response to, we have a response to an inquiry by Mayor Redekop. I think that gets read, if I'm not mistaken. Do you want to share your copy? Okay. Mr. Brady?
Thank you. This is a response to an inquiry by Mayor Redekop. It was made on October the 21st, and the mayor inquired as to the schedule to the completion of the construction of a sidewalk on the south side of Dominion Road, across the frontage of the Deerwood Lane condominium development. The response is the Deerwood Lane condominium was subject to a site plan approval process for the construction of the proposed units and associated servicing included road, water mains, sewers, hydro, and street lighting. The developer was also responsible to complete off-site works, including the construction of a sidewalk across the Dominion Road frontage of the development. We have marked up a drawing for your reference, which is attached on page 2. Please note that the completion of the segment of sidewalk there will still remain an incomplete gap across the frontage of 3583 Dominion. The new active transportation master plan has identified key missing links and priorities for the sidewalks throughout the town. In consulting with the Infrastructure Services Department, it's our understanding that the current sidewalk budget only accounts for sidewalk repairs to meet the legislative requirements. Council may wish to increase the SIDE 20 capital program to include minor improvements to the system such as this location. Since the developer has been reluctant to provide a schedule to complete the work on Dominion Road, Planning and Development Services have advised the developer that they must complete the sidewalk construction by no later than November 29th. Not too sure what the snow is going to do to that, but anyway. If the work is not completed by the set deadline, planning staff will follow the necessary procedures laid out in the site plan agreement to have this work completed on the developer's behalf using the securities on hand. Now, my only caveat, which is not on this, but the storm that we had recently tends to always push these things off a little, so we may give them a little bit of time beyond November 29th, but the intent is get it done.
Thank you, Mr. Brady. Mr. Redekop.
I just wanted to thank staff. The problem with respect to the drainage aspect has been dealt with, so now it's really just a matter of completing the sidewalk, and obviously that's dependent upon the weather. Well, thank you.
Are there any further inquiries? Seeing none, that brings us to business status report. Any comments or questions? Seeing none, Planning Development Services is now closed.
Thank you very much, Councillor Noyes, and that takes us to Infrastructure Services. Is that Councillor McDermott? No. Councillor Lubberts? Councillor Lubberts.
Yes, thank you very much, Mayor Redekop. Infrastructure Services is now in session. We have no reports. We have no delegations or presentations. That brings us to new business inquiries. We have a couple of inquiries. Councillor Butler and Councillor Noyes. Councillor Butler, you received your response. Are you satisfied with? Okay. And Councillor Noyes.
Excuse me.
You also have an inquiry.
Point of order. This should be read into the record. The problem is that we ask the questions, and if the responses aren't read back at a council meeting, the public doesn't know what's happened.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Walsh, you want to carry forward?
I'd love to, thank you. So Councillor Butler inquired about the status of repairs on Windmill Point Road and Park Road resurfacing. In response, we offer that the section of Windmill Point Road between Dominion and Thunder Bay was pulverized and double surface treated. There was a section in the middle that is hot mixed, and that was skipped as it's in good condition. And you had asked about the remainder of the road as well. Our town's pavement management system indicates the remainder of Windmill Road is in good condition and does not require rehabilitation at this time. There is an exception of a small section that acts as the beach access to the south end. We'll be doing for a little work on that. With respect to Park Road, paving took place during the week of October 28th.
And would you like to comment on Councillor Noyes?
Thank you.
Request?
So Councillor Noyes inquired at the October 21st council meeting regarding the status of resurfacing on roads in Black Creek. Specifically when the second surface treatment of River Trail, Teresa, and River Trail Crescent would be placed. I did respond that it was my understanding at the time that it had been completed. That was in error. In speaking with staff, the second surface treatment was not applied despite the contractor Norjon Paving having ample time to undertake the task. And speaking with the management of Norjon, they too were surprised that it had not been done, and they have nothing to offer other than a mea culpa, a my fault. We do plan to complete the resurfacing in the spring. Staff have yet to determine if the contract with Norjon will be maintained so that they can apply it, or if the contract will be closed and the work will be retendered as part of our 2020 resurfacing program. The road will be examined in the spring to determine if the final surface treatment is sufficient or if a double layer is required, as the road has only had a single surface treatment since August 2018.
Councillor Noyes?
Thank you. I have some concerns about this. This road was a problem after the first application. There was a problem with the amount of loose gravel that was on there. I think I brought it up a few times in council. And I think Councillor Dubanow even referred to it as it was a nice gravel road. And I said, well, it's not supposed to be a gravel road. That's the problem. It is a gravel road. And since then, we've had it swept twice, which means the stone has been taken away. So there's been a fair amount of stone removed that was put there. I think it's put there because it's supposed to stay there. But of course, it's so loose, it goes, and the people have had it in their yards and have cleaned up their yards several times. We're now going to have a second winter where the snow plows are going to be again plowing the roads like they should, and then you're going to lose even more of the gravel and the first coat. I'm concerned that, and I know we're going to look at it in the spring, but this is not an ideal road for surface treatment anyway. It's an urban area. It's a river trail. There's a curved road for the most part. Where this has occurred, there's a lot of stops and starting, and it was a problem right from the get-go. It didn't behave like it should have, and I'm concerned that the residents now are going to have to go through it again, or that if we have a second treatment on the first treatment, I know we're going to look at it, but again, I think there's going to be, I don't know. I wouldn't say if it's okay. And I've got a really little bit of knowledge on this because I've been doing some research. Is that I think the ideal time between first and second application is not a year and a half. I think there's a reason that they prefer that the time frame, I think, between first and second application should be within 3 months is the optimum. I'm sure Mr. Welsh can correct me if I'm wrong, but we're way past that. And I'm just hoping that in the spring we do relook at this, particularly if the first code basically we have to start from square one again. The residents are going to have to be put through that again, that we do consider having it paved, which I personally think it should have been done in the first place. And I'm hoping that that option be looked at in the future. And that when we do it, whether it's a double layer, whether it's paved, that it's done correctly. Now, I don't know what to tell the residents. I wouldn't mind having, but we've been promising them this for, since August 2018. And so now they're not going to get it done until sometime in 2020. I know it's not our fault. But again, what do we tell the residents?
Mr. Walsh, do you know much more about the 3-month period for applying the second coat?
Depending on what was placed originally, the original plan on this was to let it set up over the winter and apply the second coat in 2019. Obviously, that meets all specifications. So in this case, the 3 months wouldn't apply, but I understand the councillor's concerns. We do have plans to put together a little leaflet, deliver it to affected homeowners, explaining what the process is going forward and where we are right now.
Yeah, and I can appreciate that we want to inform the residents on what's gone on. But I'm fielding phone calls again. I think 3 weeks ago, actually, one of the gentlemen that was here for another reason, complained about, again, loose gravel, that he got his windshield got hit by loose gravel again, not by anybody going fast. And there's still a considerable amount of loose gravel on this road. And when the snow plows go through, we know the gravel's going to go into the grass, and then we're going to have, another issue to deal with. So again, it's something we have to deal with. I know nobody likes it, but, I'm wishing it was paved. We wouldn't have had this problem.
Any other, Councillor Zanko?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Mr. Walsh. Just a comment and a question. First off, thank you to staff over this last snowfall. They did a great job plowing everyone out, and I know they worked around the clock. One question that I've had quite often over the past day is in some areas, and I've seen it on a number of roads in Crescent Park, residents are left with rather high snow piles in their driveway, blocking their driveway. It seems that obviously we had a lot of snow, but they would just get themselves shoveled out and the plow would come by and they would be snowed in. Particularly the elderly residents are having a really hard time with this because the snow is icy and packed. Is there anything that we can do to kind of avoid this? I thought I remembered years ago that had something to do with the height that the shovels are kept on the tractors, but I could be wrong.
Mr. Walsh?
Thank you. If a resident is shoveling their own driveway, what they can do is when they shovel, if they're looking at the road, shovel it on the right side, the downstream side of their driveway. For our senior residents, we do have a Snow Buddies program that can pair up qualified people with people that can come and shovel their driveway for them. If they phone into town hall here, we can direct them to the right person on that. As for the height of the plow or whatever, that doesn't matter.
For speed or no?
No.
Okay, thank you. And just an inquiry, and this is something that Mr. Walsh, through you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Walsh, if perhaps you could get back to me. We were discussing leaflets, and you had just mentioned leaflets, which kind of piqued my memory. We discussed leaflets being handed out to Lakeside residents, just with an update regarding the road works. I just wanted to follow up to see if that has been done yet.
No, that has not been done, and we will get on that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Any other new business or inquiries? Councillor Dubanow?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Mr. Walsh, over the weekend, I was speaking with a resident who brought up there's a sign in Greenwood Cemetery for, it's a garden of remembrance, and they had actually snapped a picture and they had posted it online, and it showed the sign in disrepair. And I'm just wondering if perhaps, I'm not sure who the owner is, if it was something that was put up by the town or if there was like a volunteer organization that had done this, perhaps a Legion, I'm not entirely sure. But I'm just wondering maybe if it is something that we maintain, if we could perhaps have a look at that. And if not, is it possible to maybe reach out to whoever installed the sign and is responsible for it, just to let them know that it requires some repairs? It's just with Remembrance Day just passing, and the service that these men offered to our country, I think it just might be something to look at it. It's just in a real rough state of repair, and something maybe we could look at.
Mr. Walsh?
Yes, we can look into that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Noyes?
Thank you, Councillor Lubberts. I have another inquiry about river trails. Has nothing to do with the roads, but in the last big storm we had with the wind and the rain, there was already flooding from the new development, from the river trail development, and there was flooding already. And it was interesting from the pictures that the flooding wasn't from the creek. like you would think that the water rose and it came in from the creek. It didn't come in from the creek. It came in from what appeared to be from the development, because it was backed up onto people's properties and into at least one or two of the homes. I'm just wondering, there's no homes yet in this development. It hasn't started yet. Is this kind of like a warning that perhaps maybe the grading plan or something more needs to be done? Because this is one storm, and already the water couldn't get the ditches that it's empty. And there's a stormwater management pond. I know it goes into the ditches. It's supposed to go into the creek. But for whatever reason, it couldn't drain fast enough, and that caused the overflow. Is this like the 1 in a 100-year storm, or is there anything we can do to look at it now? I know there are some barriers to the water getting from the ditches into the creek, because, and I know it's from a conservation point of view, that there's some silt barriers and some bales of hay and things like that prevent the water from free flowing there. But again, it is causing a problem. I don't know if we've looked into that, or we know what's causing the problem before we get another storm.
Mr. Walsh, you comment on that?
Through you, Chair, to the
Mr.
councillor.
Cockett?
I did talk to Councillor Noyes about this last week, and I did look into it a little further. So just a couple comments. There is straw bales at the outlet, and those we put there to control the silt so it doesn't go into the creek. So it does slow down the flow from the stormwater. Once those are removed, excuse me, it will help the flow and hopefully address some of the stormwater issues. The other issue that was happening out there was there's 2 catch basins that were installed along the roadside in the ditches as part of the outlet control. Those catch basins had filter cloth on them as well. So what that does is collect sediment, but it also slows down the flow into those catch basins. So we've gone out there, taken a look at it, and I believe we're at a stage now, because there's been some growth around those catch basins, we could remove that filter cloth. And so I don't think you're going to get the overland flow to those 2 residents as we had last week. I think we've now corrected the problem.
Thank you.
Any other? Councillor Butler?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question with respect to, again, Shirley Road and the flooding that took place there, and that often takes place there. And I just wondered, I know that there was a tour for the disaster relief program, and that probably comes under purview of the CAO, and that in the next phase of the agenda tonight. But I just wondered, is there anything that we can do to put a plan in place to fix the problem that's out there, because these homeowners are being affected so poorly that that their houses are starting to devalue? And that one property where the tour did take place, they lost 2 vehicles as a direct result, and that was an $80,000 hit.
Mr. Cockett, you want to handle that?
Through you, Chair, to the councillor, just a few comments as well. They were part of the tour last week, and just so anybody that's listening is, we've been in contact with the ministry. We've had a couple conference calls with them. We provided them with a tour last Thursday. They saw all the damages throughout Fort Erie, and then they moved on to Port Colborne and Wainfleet. 3 individuals came from the ministry, and basically were collecting data and going to take that back. And once we make our submission, which we have 120 days to do, show damages with projected cost, they will make a recommendation to the minister, and at that point they'll determine if we had a disaster or not, if we qualify for funding. So that's the status of that. It's going to take a little while. As far as, is there anything we can do to help those residents along there? I don't really think we can, other than maybe looking at their properties and the grading around their properties. If they brought in some fill, would that help flooding issues? So we would be open to help them with those solutions, if there is a solution. I know there's been some questioning about, is there any liability on the town for issuing these permits? the responsibility of issuing the permits falls under the chief building official, obviously. So he reviews the drawings, make sure that they meet the building code. He circulates the drawings. He makes sure that it meets all statutes and all zoning requirements. The other is that he does check to see if the home or the building application is in a floodplain. The floodplain is actually established by the Conservation Authority, so we don't have control of that. If it is identified as floodplain in the floodplain mapping, then we will not issue a permit. So in this case, it wasn't in the floodplain, so we did issue a permit back in the day. Going forward, what do? As long as it meets all the requirements, we issue the permit. It's unfortunate, but like I say, the only solution I can think of is maybe help them with some grading issues that probably are going to help very minimal, to be honest with you.
Thank you for the information. I wonder if we could just set up a meeting with those neighbors, because there were some suggestions that they had. For instance, Port Colborne has a gate that they close so that the flooding doesn't affect the residents, and then it opens up after the flooding has taken place. I don't have the particulars on that.
Through your chair to the councillor. So yes, in Port Colborne, I think it's called the Eagle Marsh Drain, they do have a pump. And this is one of the things that we are actually looking at for Point Abino as well. So you have a flap gate, the flap gate closes, but what it does is it blocks the water from running into the lake. So then you install a pump and you pump over that gate to give relief. Very expensive. So back in the day when we looked at Point Abino, I think at that time it was $1 million. It is very costly, and there again, anybody in that watershed would have to pick up those costs if that's the way we went. But I'd be more than willing to meet with the people, with our directors, and see if we can come up with a solution.
Any other comments? Mayor Redekop?
Yeah, it seems to me, and I spoke to Mr. Cookett about this briefly, it seems to me that we maybe should be looking at, and I'll probably give notice of motion next week, seeking some advice from staff with respect to policies that we have that may be affected by climate change, or that can be implemented to try to address some of the impacts of climate change in planning, in infrastructure. I'll have to have further discussions with Mr. Cookett to see what areas we might be able to impact. But this is something that's been happening now frequently, and there doesn't appear to be any end in sight. So we may have to see what things there are that we can do to at least, if not protect current residents, although that would be an objective if we could accomplish it, make sure that we don't do things that could negatively impact inadvertently future residents.
Thank you, Mayor Redekop. Any other new business or inquiries? I have just a couple here. Mr. Walsh, as far as the response to Councillor Noyes, the thing that bothers me is everybody was surprised that the job wasn't completed on River Trail. And I know that as an electrician, when we get involved in some of the bigger jobs, not so much residential, but more commercial jobs, we get to a point where there's substantial completion and then final completion, and people sign off on that. And we have our inspections, as well as, the carpenters and plumbers and everybody else. And do we not inspect these projects, and do we not sign off on final completion and substantial and, have some kind of pay?
Yes, we do, Councillor. I'm not quite sure what you're getting at here.
Was it inspected, and did we get a final inspection?
On the Black Creek roads?
No, on River Trail.
The Black Creek roads.
Yeah,
No,
Black Creek.
they were never inspected because they were never done. We were in constant contact with, at a staff level, both our PM and our our construction supervisor. We were in constant contact with Norjon personnel, their project manager and paving foreman. But when I contacted the manager of Norjon, he was just as surprised as I was.
Well, I mean, Councillor Noyes' inquiry was to when would the second treatment of River Trail be completed? So we must have done the first one, and that had to have been inspected, and then you don't have final completion.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So
So
how would
the first treatment was done in August 2018. The prescribed treatment under that 2018 resurfacing contract was one surface treatment. Second treatment was prescribed under our 2019 program. And it never got done.
And so it was put together, but it was never followed up on. I don't get how this all happens. I mean, the developers or the contractor is trying to say, well, it's your fault. Well,
No, he's not.
oh, why is it not being done? I mean, I think that what we need to do is we need to take a second look at how we're going about with our contracts and making sure that they're inspected and they're completed. That's all I'm saying, because this here, to me, is disturbing. To me, it's unacceptable. I don't think that we should be putting something out there and saying, yes, this is what's going to be done, and then there's no follow-up afterwards, and then the councillor has to come back and say, well, when is it going to get done? And everybody says, oh, we're surprised that it never got done. I don't get it, but it is what it is. And the second request I got is on Glen Spring and Ashwood area with that new subdivision there on Schooley. The resident on Glen Spring called me, and when we had all that rain and everything, they got flooded out in their backyard, and it was in the back on the top of the hill, and it was all brown water, and so it was obviously it came off of that new subdivision because there's no grass or anything there. But there's a stormwater management pond there as well. And the stormwater management pond was nowhere near full. Yet all the water was coming out of there, that subdivision, and going into our late Shirley Wallington's backyard and Tommy Nielsen's and his wife's backyard where they built their new garage. And I'm just wondering if we can go by, take a look there, and see that we got proper grading there and that everything is draining into that stormwater management pond properly. And the reason I bring that up is we need to check the grade is because we know that there was a problem when they extended Elizabeth, when Miss Sass was living there. The guy that was on the excavator, he said, this is all wrong. This elevation won't work. It was, when he was done, it was way too low. They had to build it back up again. And I'm just curious as to whether that whole subdivision is not graded properly. So can we look into that and see if at least it's, get the water to go into the water management pond?
Councillor Lubberts, as we all know, the storm of October 31st was unprecedented in terms of driving rain and such inland. It's not surprising that water didn't make it to the storm pond. Councillor Noyes has brought up a subject tonight of a somewhat similar situation, I would think. But certainly we can go out and consult with our design engineer on that project and ensure that the grades are meeting what is specified.
Yeah, the grade should be met and the grade should be flowing towards the pond, right? Am I correct?
The grades should be flowing where they're specified to flow.
Yeah, okay, all right, thank you. Any other comments, new business inquiries? Seeing none, that takes us to the business status report. Any comments or questions? Seeing none, infrastructure services is now in recess. I'll turn the chair back over to Mayor Redekop.
Thank you very much, Councillor Lubberts, and that takes us to corporate and community services. Councillor Dubanow.
Thank you, Your Worship. Corporate and Community Services is now in session. We have no presentations or delegations this evening. That brings us to reports. So we have CAO-30-2-2019, the supplementary report on the whistleblower policy. Could I get a mover for that? No, this is supplemental. That's moved by Councillor Zanko. Do we have any comments or questions from council on the supplementary report? All right, so in that case, I'll call the question. All those in favor? None opposed, that carries. So that now brings us to CAO-30-2019, which had been moved by Councillor Zanko on November 4th. And I believe, based on what we had during the last council and committee, that we need to move an amendment to include the recommendations from the supplementary report. Just curious if someone would like to do that. I saw his worship's hand go up first, so we'll move that. So any comments or questions with regard to the amendment? All right, so I'm seeing none, so all those in favor? So then none opposed, that carries. So that brings us back to the original report itself, which has already been moved. Do we have any further comments or questions on that? All right, seeing none, so I'll call the question. All those in favor? I see all hands up, so that carries. So that then brings us to new business inquiries. I see Councillor Butler's hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was wondering, I know that we voted in favor of going into closed session tonight, but I'm wondering if we can postpone it to next week for two reasons. It is getting late in the evening, and secondly, it gives staff an opportunity to gather the information so that they can disseminate that information properly to us.
We're going to leave that up to Councillor Lubberts. I think you're absolutely correct. That'll allow staff to get some information together.
No, I actually agree with that as well. So
we're going to come to that. We're going to come to that part.
all right, sounds good. Are there any other comments, questions regarding new business? All right, so I'm seeing none. So that brings us to the business status report. Comments, questions from council? All right, so I guess that's it. I will return the chair back to his worship.
Very efficient, Councillor Dubanow.
Thank you.
Are there any, that takes us to scheduling of meetings. Are there any meetings coming up anyone wishes to announce? Councillor Dubanow.
Schedule that.
Scheduling of meetings.
Want to schedule the closed session?
I'm coming to that.
Yeah, I'm just I'm quickly zooming through my calendar here. Yeah, we have a community health services committee meeting tomorrow at Town Hall at 5 o'clock. I believe that will be in committee room 1, unless that's changed.
I think that's correct. Yeah. Any other meetings? And okay, so that what I have on the agenda then was that we were going to go into closed session. We've just had a discussion about that. Councillor Lubberts, you've indicated that you're agreeable to this being deferred until next Monday, which would be November the 18th. That can be made part of our
After the council.
That's right. It'll be at the end of the council meeting and part of our agenda. Next council meeting won't be until December the 2nd, so it'll be like 3 weeks from now. I don't know. Is there activity going on between? Let's ask Councillor Lubberts. Councillor Zanko has just asked if it could be put over to December the 2nd because she's not going to be here next week. So it really depends on how
Well,
important you feel.
if she's going south, then we'll have the meeting down south. We'll all
She's
go.
going where it's snowing,
Huh?
so it doesn't work.
Yeah, no, that's fine, yeah. No, we need to clear this up, and we need to know where we're going with this whole issue.
And it really doesn't
And
prevent,
it doesn't matter, timing is not an issue.
right.
Yeah.
Okay, so,
December?
Madam Clerk, it'll be on the December 2nd agenda,
Yes, your worship.
which is already jam-packed. But I'm wondering if maybe staff could also contemplate circulating some information to council members in the meantime.
I can certainly disseminate some of the information that is public
Yeah, exactly.
information, but
Yeah.
there may be additional information that I'd be able to provide at the
That's why I
session.
said you can contemplate that. Okay, that takes us then to adjournment. Councillor Dubanow. I'll move that. Perfect. All those in favor? None opposed, that is carried.